Neither Bullets Nor Ballots, Essays on Voluntaryism. Essays by Carl Watner, George H. Smith, and Wendy McElroy. Published for the Voluntarists. First printing was December 1983, 2,000 copies. Statement of Purpose. The Voluntarists are libertarians who have organized to promote non-political strategies to achieve a free society. We reject electoral politics, in theory and in practice, as incompatible with libertarian goals. Governments must cloak their actions in an aura of moral legitimacy in order to sustain their power, and political methods invariably strengthen that legitimacy. Voluntarists seek instead to delegitimize the state through education, and we advocate withdrawal of the cooperation and tacit consent on which state power ultimately depends. Introduction. Neither Bullets Nor Ballots by Wendy McElroy. The Voluntarist seeks to reclaim the anti-political heritage of libertarianism. It seeks to reestablish the clear, clean difference between the economic and the political means of changing society. This difference was well perceived by the forerunners of contemporary libertarianism who tore the veil of legitimacy away from government to reveal a criminal institution which claimed a monopoly of force in a given area. Accordingly, early libertarians such as Benjamin Tucker maintained that one could no more attack government by electing politicians than one could prevent crime by being a criminal. Although he did not question the sincerity of political anarchists, he described them as enemies of liberty. Quote, "Those who distrust her as a means of progress, believing in her only as an end to be obtained by first trampling upon, violating, and outraging her." This rejection of the political process, by which I mean electoral politics, was a moral one, based on the insight that no one has the right to a position of power over others, and that any man who seeks such an office, however honorable his intentions, is seeking to join a criminal band. Somewhere in the history of libertarianism, this rejection of the state has been eroded to the point that anarchists are now aspiring politicians and can hear the words "anarchist senator" without flinching. No longer is libertarianism directed against the positions of power, against the offices through which the state is manifested. The modern message, complete with straw hats, campaign rhetoric, and strategic evasion, is "elect my man to office," as if it were the man disgracing the office and not the other way around. Those who point out that no one has the right to such a position, that such power is anathema to the concept of rights itself, are dismissed as negative, reactionary, or crackpot. They are subject to ad hominem attacks, which divert attention from the substantive issues being raised, the issues which will be discussed in the Voluntarist. The Voluntarist is unique in that it reflects both the several centuries of libertarian tradition and the current cutting edge of libertarian theory. The tradition of American libertarianism is so inextricably linked with anarchism that, during the 19th century, individualist anarchism was a synonym for libertarianism. But anarchism is more than simply the non-initiation of force by which libertarianism is commonly defined. It is a view of the state as the major violator of rights, as the main enemy. Anarchism analyzes the state as an institution whose purpose is to violate rights in order to secure benefits to a privileged class. For those who believe in the propriety of a limited government, it makes sense to pursue political office. But for an anarchist who views the state as a fundamentally evil institution, such a pursuit flies in the face of the theory and the tradition which he claims to share. Thus, the political anarchist must explain why he aspires to an office he proclaims inherently unjust. Perhaps one reason for the erosion of anarchism within the libertarian movement is that many of the questions necessary to a libertarian institutional analysis of the state have never been seriously addressed. A goal of the Voluntarist is to construct a cohesive theory of anti-political libertarianism, of voluntaryism, which will investigate such issues as whether moral or legal liabilities adhere to the act of voting someone into power over another's life. Perhaps by working out the basics of this theory, the unhappy spectacle of the anarchist as politician can be avoided. Another major goal is to examine non-political strategies. In constructing anti-political theory and strategy, which was assumed by early libertarians without being well defined, we will be labeled as merely counter-libertarian party by those who innocently, or with malice, are unable to perceive the wider context which leads to a rejection of the political means itself. The myriad of non-political strategies available to libertarians will be dismissed, or will be accepted only as useful adjuncts to electoral politics. It is ironic that a movement which uses the free market as a solution for everything from roads to national defense declares that political means, the antithesis of the free market, are necessary to achieve freedom. As voluntarists, we reject the Libertarian Party on the same level and for the same reason that we reject any other political party. The rejection is not based on incidental evasions or corruption of principle, which inevitably occur within politics. It is based on the conviction that to oppose the state, one must oppose the specific instances of the state, or else one's opposition is toward a vague, floating abstraction, and never has practical application. Political offices are the state. By becoming politicians, libertarians legitimize and perpetuate the office. They legitimize and perpetuate the state. If libertarianism has a future, it is as a movement which takes a principled, resounding stance against the state. Those who embrace political office hinder the efforts of voluntarists who are attempting to throw off this institution of force. It is common for libertarians to view anarchism and minarchism as two trains going down the same track. Minarchism simply stops a little before anarchism's destination. This is a mistaken notion. The destination of anarchism is different from and antagonistic to the destination of minarchism. The theory and the emotional commitment are different. Murray Rothbard captured the emotional difference by asking his famous question in Libertarian Forum, quote, "Do you hate the state?" Voluntarists respond with an immediate, heartfelt yes. Minarchists give reserved, qualified agreement, all the while explaining the alleged distinction between a government and a state. Political anarchists are in the gray realm of agreeing heartily in words to principles which their actions contradict. It is time to have the differences between voluntarism and political libertarianism clearly expressed and for non-political alternatives to be pursued. It is time for the Voluntarist.
Welcome to Essential Libertarianism, selected readings from voluntarist.com. Essential Libertarianism is voluntarism. Let's reclaim the anti-political heritage of this philosophy together. The essays and books we read in this show will bring us closer to the state-free voluntary society that we desire. Let's begin the journey.
Article 1, Party Dialogue by George H. Smith.
Considering the success that the Libertarian Party has enjoyed in recent years, especially in bringing libertarian ideas to the attention of the general public, I'm curious why you refuse to support the LP. In fact, you criticize it openly.
You raise two issues that need to be untangled. First, I criticize the political side of the LP, i.e. its efforts to place libertarians in political office. I don't object to its educational endeavors, as I don't object to any organization that seeks to roll back the state. Secondly, it is true that the LP gains publicity, but we must ask whether this is the kind of publicity that furthers libertarian goals. Publicity that links libertarianism to a political party, when the essence of libertarianism is anti-political, is counterproductive.
But the public understands that the LP is a party with a difference. It is devoted to liberty. That is the important thing.
You beg the question, can a political party be dedicated to uncompromised liberty? I answer no, and this is why I reject the LP.
I disagree. There's no reason why libertarian legislators could not dedicate themselves to the repeal of unjust laws. We must remember that the ultimate goal of the LP is a free society.
Let's separate campaign rhetoric from reality. It's easy to say that the goal of the LP is a free society. What political party in its right mind would come out against a free society? The important point is, what makes the LP a political party? What is its essential characteristic? In other words, what does the LP have in common with other political parties that it does not share with non-political organizations? The answer is simple. The LP seeks political power. The immediate goal of the LP, qua political party, is and must be to wrest control of the state apparatus from its competitors, the Democrats and Republicans. The LP bids in the political auction, using the currency of votes in an attempt to buy control of the state machinery.
You're really off base. The LP does not seek power. On the contrary, it wants to reduce power by dismantling the state. Getting elected to political office is simply a means to this noble end.
Let's be clear about this. There is a difference between having power and exercising it. Those who control the state have immense power, whether or not they exercise it in particular instances. Those who control the state have immense power, whether or not they exercise it in particular instances. Political power, the capacity and legal sanction to aggress against others, is integral to political office. A state official, libertarian or not, has considerable power over defenseless citizens. It's disingenuous to claim that one aspires to political office but does not seek power. Power is a defining characteristic of political office.
But this is mere semantics. A libertarian politician might have power in a legal sense, but he would not use that power unjustly. His power would be used to combat other politicians and to repeal invasive laws.
You've just conceded my point. Legal power, which you dismiss so lightly, is what makes a politician a politician. A politician can get together with his neighbors, other politicians, and vote to rob people, and he can bring the force of law to back up this vote. But if I and my neighbors vote to rob someone, we cannot do it with the sanction of law. The politician has this political power, whereas the private citizen does not. This characteristic of political office must never be forgotten. You admit that even the libertarian politician will have this power after he's elected, but you stipulate that it would be used for beneficent purposes. You prefer to emphasize the presumed motives of libertarian politicians, their honorable intentions, whereas I prefer to stress the reality of what political office entails. I don't want anyone to have political power, regardless of his supposed good intentions. I object to the political office itself and to its legitimized power. Frankly, I don't give a whit about the psychological state of the politician.
You seem to be saying that you don't trust the libertarian politician to keep his word. Well, we live in an imperfect world with no absolute guarantees. We hope that the libertarian politicians will not compromise. If they do, we shall be the first to denounce them.
The issue of trust is quite secondary. Whether I trust this or that politician is not the point, although it does raise an interesting problem. Should the wise maxim often quoted by libertarians, power corrupts, now be amended to read, power corrupts unless you're a libertarian? It is not clear to me why libertarians are any less susceptible to the temptations of power than the ordinary mortal. But as I said, this is not fundamental. I may trust a particular libertarian politician, but I still don't want him to have political power over me. Libertarians stress that liberty is a natural right. If a legal political system violates this right as a matter of policy, then the system is unjust to some degree. Libertarians should oppose this injustice in principle. We should seek to abolish the mechanism whereby one individual, in virtue of political office, can employ legitimized aggression against other individuals. Elect me to office, proclaims the libertarian politician. Give me enormous power over you and your property, but rest assured that I shall abstain from using this power unjustly. I reply, you have no right to such power in the first place. And as a libertarian, you should know this. You should be denouncing the very office to which you aspire. You say your campaign literature is honest and forthright, Mr. Would-be Senator, but search as I may, I cannot find the statement, the office of senator as we know it should be abolished. This lacuna is understandable, however, in view of the embarrassment that the statement would cause you. For then even a child might be prompted to ask, but, Mr. Would-be Senator, if the institution of senator is wrong in itself because of its built-in political power, then how can you in good conscience ask us to make you a senator?
You bog down in technicalities. This business about the incompatibility of libertarianism and political office is just so much theoretical fluff. Let's get down to the real world. I still don't see why a libertarian senator could not consistently and conscientiously work for the elimination of unjust laws.
If you don't see it, it is because, to paraphrase Plato, you have eyes but no intelligence. You don't see the answer because you don't ask the right question. We don't start with a concept of a libertarian senator and then inquire whether this person can be trusted. The basic difficulty is with the concept of a libertarian senator to begin with. Libertarian and senator, for senator read any political office, are like a square and a circle. One cannot be both at the same time and in the same respect. The technicality to which you object is the law of non-contradiction. What does it mean in this society to be a senator? Among other things, it signifies the legal privilege to formulate and enact laws without any necessary regard for the justice of those laws. And it permits one to dispense massive amounts of stolen money. Such powers, inherent in the office of senator, are incompatible with libertarian principles. Libertarians should oppose not just this or that senator, but the office of senator itself.
But couldn't a libertarian accept a political office while being fully aware that the legal power inherent in that office is illegitimate? He need not exercise the options legally available to him after all. As a libertarian, he would know that he has no right to act unjustly, regardless of his political situation.
You confuse the subjective with the objective. A person can believe just about anything. A libertarian senator may believe that he's faking it, that he doesn't really take the authority of his office seriously. He may convince himself that, although an agent, an employee of the state, he's really and truly anti-state. It is similarly possible, I suppose, for an army general to convince himself that he's anti-military despite his occupation. Whether this kind of subversion from within is good strategy is a topic for another conversation, but the facts remain. The office of senator is defined independently of the desires of individual senators. The powers of political office do not depend upon the secret desires of the LP politician, nor do they change because the politician keeps his fingers crossed while taking the oath of office. One cannot deny the legitimacy of the senatorial office, as libertarians must logically do, and simultaneously advocate someone for that position. One should not accept the designation of senator, knowing full well what this implies, while mouthing libertarian principles. Consider an extreme case. If we lived under a dictatorship, would the LP advocate that a libertarian take over the office of dictator, or would it fight for the abolition of dictatorship itself?
Abolition must certainly be the goal of any libertarian. This doesn't mean, however, that abolition could not be achieved through the former method. It would be preferable to have a libertarian dictator who refuses to exercise the powers of his office rather than an authentic dictator. Don't you agree?
If we must have a dictator, then I prefer to have the most benign one possible. But a benign dictator is still a dictator. And if there were a group of self-professed libertarians who were expending their time, energy, and resources in an effort to put their version of a benign dictator in power to replace the current one, then I would have grave doubts about their libertarian credentials. And I would view their candidate for dictator as a threat, even if one less serious than the present dictator.
So you would support the libertarian dictator?
No, I would not support any dictator. I might prefer your dictator to the current one, but I wouldn't support either of them. If I'm given a choice between Mr. Jones, who plans to cut off my head, and Mr. White, who plans to cut off my hands, then I may prefer Mr. White to Mr. Jones, since I would rather lose my hands than my head. But I certainly wouldn't support or condone either Mr. Jones or Mr. White. Both are my enemies, even if one is relatively less harmful than the other. We must not forget the central point. Your dictator might be preferable to another dictator. There are obvious differences in degree. But we are concerned not only with the relative demerits of dictators, but with the possibility that one can be a dictator and a libertarian at the same time. Can libertarians actively support and promote a benign dictator just because he might be the best dictator available? This is a peculiar situation indeed, and it would force libertarians to support the lesser of two evils. In short, I would not call your candidate for dictator a libertarian, because the two are incompatible. I might call him a well-intentioned dictator, but he is no libertarian, and I would oppose him because my principles leave me no option. There is no proviso in my stand against dictators that exempts those with good intentions. Similarly, your libertarian senator may do less harm and even some positive good when compared to Democrats and Republicans. He may reduce taxes, for example, or help avoid war. But fewer taxes and peace are not distinctively libertarian positions. Some conservatives and liberals advocate the same things. What distinguishes libertarianism is the basis for its opposition to taxes and war, the rights of the individual, and the logical extreme to which it carries its opposition. Most importantly, there is the libertarian analysis of the state as a ruling elite, the fundamental cause of taxes and war. The oppressive nature of the state is at the core of libertarian theory, and it requires libertarians to take a principled stand against the state per se. Now the state is an institution with different levels of authority, and it is this authority, legitimized aggression, as I described earlier, which libertarians must oppose. You see, therefore, that libertarians must stand firm against all senators, all presidents, and so forth, because these offices and the legal power they embody are indispensable features of the state apparatus. After all, what can it possibly mean to oppose the state unless one opposes particular offices and institutions in which state power manifests itself? Do we dislike President Carter because he has the wrong ideas? No, we dislike him because he is dangerous, and he is dangerous because he is president. Millions of individuals may have even worse ideas than Carter, but we don't single them out for disdain unless they are in a position to enforce their views. The danger lies not in Carter, but in the presidency. Carter derives his power from the office and its legal sanctions. The political office itself is the fundamental danger, and that is what we must strive to eliminate. Certainly Carter is a dangerous man, but anyone who is president is dangerous as well. The presidency embodies political power on an enormous scale, and any person occupying that office, libertarian or not, must be opposed by right-thinking libertarians.
Well, your ultimate goals are commendable, but you live in a fantasy world. You don't really believe that political offices are just going to fade away, do you?
No, but neither do I believe that a group of libertarians are going to take over the government, establish themselves in power, and then attempt to abolish the instrument of their power and livelihood, the state. Now there is a real fantasy.
So what do you suggest instead? It's one thing to criticize, but it's more difficult to map an alternate strategy.
First of all, let's get something straight. This is not, I repeat, not an issue of strategy. You LPers seem to have difficulty in understanding this, so I have to place special emphasis on it. I am not accusing the LP of faulty strategy here, although this is a lively topic for another discussion. This is not simply a matter of how to get from here to there.
But we both agree on the desirability of a free society. It seems to me that we just disagree on how best to achieve it.
Yes, we are in basic agreement concerning the goal to be achieved, but I am not merely asserting that the political method is inefficient in pursuit of this goal. Rather, I'm arguing that the political means is inconsistent with libertarian principles, that it flies in the face of basic libertarian ideals. Consider an analogy. I state that a basic goal in my life is to acquire a good deal of money. You can see that this goal is, in itself, unobjectionable. Then I proceed to rob a bank. You're horrified and demand to know how I could do such a thing. I reply that we have a strategic difference of opinion. We both agree that my goal is laudable. We simply disagree concerning the means by which to attain it. We disagree on how to get from here to there. So I demand from you an alternative strategy for me to get rich. Sure, I say my plan may not be perfect, but what can you purists offer in its place? Give me an alternate strategy, I demand, before taking pot shots at mine. How would you reply to this? I suspect you would accuse me of shifting ground. You would point out that the objection to robbing banks is not simply an issue of strategy, but involves profound moral questions. And you would say that your protest against my action was moral rather than strategic in nature. Therefore, unless I can surmount the moral objections to robbing banks, the strategy question is irrelevant. I cannot squirm past the moral issues, the matters of principle, in the guise of demanding alternate strategies. Now, returning to the subject of political action, I respond to your question the same way. Fine, let's get together and talk over the issue of strategy someday. We can talk about education, moral suasion, counter-economics, alternative institutions, civil disobedience, or what have you. But that's not the issue here. I submit that there is a profoundly anti-libertarian aspect of political action, i.e. of attempting to elect libertarians to public office. And this is the issue to which political libertarians must first address themselves. Show me that political action is consistent with libertarian principles, and then we can take up the issue of strategy.
But you must address yourself to the issue of strategy at some point. You wish to disqualify the political means altogether, which seems to leave you precious little by which you can work for a free society. If your principles condemn you to inaction and certain defeat, then surely there must be something wrong with your principles.
This is quite curious. You equate activism with political action. Doing something for you means doing something political. You regard an anti-political libertarian as a non-activist, and this is surely one of the most pernicious myths circulating in the LP today. Often when LP members learn that I am not a member of the party, I am greeted with the cute remark, "Oh, you're a libertarian with a small L." To this, I frankly feel like replying, "Yes, and you're an idiot with a big I."
Okay, so you don't advocate inaction or passivity. then what kind of activity, in your view, should libertarians engage in?
I will state what I regard as the major challenge confronting libertarians today. And from this, you could justify any number of different strategies. Here's the basic issue. The fight against the state is not merely a fight against naked power. The battle would be much easier if that were so. The essence of the state is not aggression per se, but legitimized aggression. The state uses the sanction of law to legitimize its criminal acts. This is what distinguishes it from the average criminal in the street. Unfortunately, the reality of the state, which it is in fact, is not how it's perceived by most Americans. To put it bluntly, the vast majority of Americans disagree with the libertarian view of the state. We may get some agreement on particular points, but the vision of the state as, in essence, a criminal gang is far more radical than most Americans are willing to accept. This defines our ultimate educational goal. We must strip the state of its legitimacy in the public eye. We must persuade people to apply the same moral standards to the state as they apply to anyone else. We need not convince people that theft is wrong. We need to convince them that theft, when committed by the state in the name of taxation, does not differ from theft when committed by an individual. We need not persuade people that murder is wrong. We need to persuade them that murder, when committed by the state in the name of war or national defense, does not differ from murder when committed by an individual. As I said before, political power represents legitimized aggression. Libertarians may not be able to stop all aggression. This would indeed be an unrealistic goal. But they can go far in stripping political aggression of its moral sanctity. This requires all the tools of persuasion that we can muster, and it also underscores the illegitimacy of political action. To run for or support candidates for political office is to grant legitimacy to the very thing we are attempting to strip of legitimacy. One cannot consistently denounce the state as a band of criminals while attempting to swell the ranks of this criminal class with one's own cronies. The hypocrisy is there for all to see. So either you have to reject political action, or you have to water down or abandon your basic principles in order to conceal the glaring inconsistency. Some people call this latter alternative being practical. I call it being dishonest and hypocritical.
So you don't think libertarians should run for political office? Does this mean that libertarians shouldn't vote either?
Definitely, but there is more involved than simply not voting. Libertarians should oppose the vote in principle. They should oppose the mechanism by which political sanctification occurs. Political power is legitimized through the electoral process. The present voting system is based on the premise that fundamental rights can be gained or surrendered depending on the vote total. Libertarians must oppose this unconscionable process. We must oppose the political process itself, the mechanism whereby some persons gain unjust but legitimized power over others. The vote sanctifies injustice. If the libertarian message is to be truly radical, if libertarians are to lead the fight, not only against this or that injustice, but against the political system that perpetuates and legitimizes injustice, then we must condemn voting altogether. A libertarian cannot use the vote for his own end, as if the vote were morally neutral. The vote is the method by which the state maintains its illusion of legitimacy. There is no way a libertarian organization can assail the legitimacy of the state while soliciting votes.
You make it sound as if pulling a lever in the election booth is an aggressive act. But it's not. There's no way you can equate the two, particularly if one votes for a libertarian.
Voting is not an aggressive act in the narrow sense, but politicians don't aggress in this sense either. A president or senator doesn't personally go out and arrest or strong-arm people who disobey their decrees. It's possible that President Carter has never personally committed an aggressive act in his life. President Johnson didn't personally travel to Vietnam to murder Vietnamese. Does this mean that libertarians cannot regard these politicians as violators of human rights? Of course not. We are dealing with a chain of command, where the upper echelon does not have to implement its own dirty work. Referring to my earlier point, however, President Johnson did not have the moral right to order the murder of innocent Vietnamese. And no politician has the moral right to order the violation of rights, however small. Now let's apply this idea to the voting booth. To be elected to public office is to gain the legal sanction to aggress. This is a fact, whether we like it or not, and whether a given politician uses his power or not. But there is no corresponding moral right. The political right to aggress is a legal fiction without foundation in moral law. I maintain, therefore, that no person has the moral right to vote. To vote a person into office is to give that person unjust authority over others. To vote for a presidential candidate is to grant to that person the legal sanction for injustice. Let us suppose that an LPer votes for Ed Clark for president. If Ed Clark were elected, he would, in his capacity as president, have the legal right of aggression. For instance, he could order the incarceration of political dissidents during a national emergency. But there's no such moral right as this. It is the usurpation of rights. And just as Ed Clark does not have the moral right to this kind of power, so no one has the right to grant him that power or to legitimize that power. When an LPer enters the voting booth, he's attempting to place in office a person who will have unjust authority over me. But, claims the LPer, his candidate will not use that power. I reply that this, even if true, is immaterial. The legitimized power embodied in the political office is not his right to give in the first place. The LPer does not have the right to aggress against me, and it is sheer presumption to assume that he has the right to grant this privilege to his political favorite. How the libertarian of all people can calmly grant his political candidate the legal right to aggress without the slightest qualms, when all libertarians know that one cannot transfer rights that one does not have in the first place, escapes my understanding.
Again, I sympathize with your point of view, but I must bring you back to the real world. In an ideal libertarian society, there would not exist voting as we know it, agreed. But in this world, voting is the method by which political change is effected, for better or worse. Today, libertarians should vote as a matter of self-defense. The government aggresses against us and will continue to aggress unless we fight back, using its own weapons if need be. Surely you wouldn't deny to libertarians the right to vote in self-defense as a means of fighting against the encroachment of state power. One can use the vote in this way without lending it moral sanction.
Again, I am accused of not living in the real world. May I suggest that this jab applies more to you than to me? I've argued that we should take a good, hard look at the world of politics. What is the state? What is the nature of political office? You reply that this is immaterial? Why? Because libertarian candidates are brimming over with good intentions. They will sneak up on the state and turn this engine of monstrous power against itself. They will win the voting game, and all the bad politicians will gracefully concede defeat, pick up their marbles, and go home in pursuit of honest work. Next, I argued that voting entails empowering someone to act as your agent, and that you cannot morally grant to your agent rights which you do not properly possess. Moreover, I pointed out that the vote is the basis of political legitimacy in America today. It is the taproot of political authority in the minds of most Americans. Now, this is a hard fact, whether we like it or not. You reply that this doesn't matter, that libertarians can overlook these inconvenient details. Other people, you argue, may think that we approve of voting and the political process because we run candidates for office, just like every political party, and because we encourage people to vote, just like every political party. Those poor, silly people. They obviously don't realize that, despite appearances, we are really against voting and political power. Deep down inside, we really oppose these things. It's just that we have to defend ourselves. To your plea of self-defense, I reply, fine, defend yourself, but leave me alone. But voting is wrong precisely because it does not leave me alone. If you elect your candidate to office in the name of self-defense, his power will not be restricted to you and to those who voted for him. He will have power over me and others like me as well. When you enter the voting booth, you are committing an act of enormous presumption. You presume that you have the right to appoint a political guardian over me, a benevolent one you claim, but a guardian nonetheless. Now, as one libertarian to another, I must repeat my question. Where did you get such a right? You have no special authority over me. Where then did you obtain the right to appoint an agent with this authority? Where do you get the nerve to advocate that Ed Clark or anyone else should have the power of life and death over me and millions of other Americans? You claim self-defense. I claim that your vote extends far beyond the legitimate boundaries of self-defense.
You place great stress on this notion of abstract political power, which you say is the legal right to aggress, and you claim that the vote sanctions this power, whether or not a particular politician exercises it. It is primarily on this basis that you exclude political action. It seems to me that you sacrifice a strategy with great potential in the name of this abstract notion. We confront real-life crises, questions of economic survival, and even of life and death. If we can elect politicians who will roll back the powers of the state and who will not use those unjust powers inherent in their offices, then I say we contribute greatly to the cause of liberty.
You missed the point of much of what I said. I, as an individual, do not somehow forbid political action. I contend that libertarian principles forbid it. You find this inconvenient, and you complain. I say, if you wish to complain, then complain about the principles, not about me. Political action conflicts with libertarian opposition to legitimized aggression, political power. Consistency demands that I reject it. I accept libertarianism, and this very acceptance compels me to reject political action. Therefore, when I'm told that political action is a good strategy to achieve libertarian goals, I can only reply, even if that were true, which I don't accept, it would not change the rightness involved. As the poet Heine once wrote, quote, "We do not take possession of our ideas, but are possessed by them. They master us and force us into the arena, where, like gladiators, we must fight for them," end quote. So here I am, logically mastered by the consistency of libertarianism, forced into the arena to fight against political action.
You anti-party types amaze me. Here we have thousands of dedicated libertarians working to change things in America, and you purists sit in your ivory towers carping away. Words, words, words. If libertarians listened to you purists, nobody would do anything, and government power would continue to increase. I suppose you'll still be spouting your principles when the state comes to haul you off to jail.
If the state hauls me off to jail, then yes, I will still be spouting my principles, especially if it's a libertarian state that does the hauling. You accuse me of purism. I reply, so what? If purism means anything, it means the refusal to budge on matters of principle even at the expense of apparent short-term gains. What is the alternative? Impurism? Corruptism? Selling outism? As long as we're discussing amazing things, let's go back to the issue of strategy, of which you seem so fond. Hasn't it ever struck you as paradoxical how libertarians who are innovative when it comes to free market alternatives can be so pedestrian and orthodox in the area of political strategy? I mean, libertarians never tire of outlining plans for free market roads, sewers, utilities, charities, schools, political forces, and even courts of law. When our critics ridicule free market education, for instance, we encourage them to expand their thinking and to reject the notion that just because government has provided something in the past, it must continue to provide it in the future. Fresh, imaginative thinking is the key here, but now comes the issue of political strategy, and the imaginative libertarian suddenly turns slavishly orthodox. He asks, quote, "How can we change things without political action? Nobody, especially the media, will pay any attention to us. Everyone knows that you have to muster the power of votes before we can change things significantly. We must get petitions signed. We must get our people on the ballot. We must get them elected to office. This is the only effective way to implement our goals," end quote. To this political libertarian, I say, if you spent a fraction of the time considering alternatives to political action as you do considering alternatives to public roads, utilities, etc., something might occur to you. You spend thousands of dollars and expend thousands of hours to get petitions signed and run political campaigns. If you spent a fraction of that energy and money on non-political alternatives, you might witness a degree of progress that you now consider impossible.
But you're forgetting about the government and its repressive laws. Somebody at some time must work to repeal those laws. Education, counter-economics, civil disobedience, alternative institutions, all of those things sound good, but of what use are they unless they result in the repeal of laws and regulations that restrict our freedom? And this repeal necessarily entails political action.
First, it's not true that laws have to be repealed in order to be rendered ineffective. There are thousands of laws on the book today which are virtually dead because the public would not tolerate their enforcement. Second, there are always plenty of political hacks around who will attempt to curry favor by doing whatever is popular with the general public. Laws will become ineffective or will be repealed when it becomes impossible to enforce them, when the public sentiment overwhelmingly opposes them. This brings me to a fundamental difference in our view of what libertarians should strive for. You wish to work directly through the political process. I maintain that this reinforces the legitimacy of that process. You tell people, in effect, that the way to assert their natural rights is to ask the government's permission. When the government gives you permission to keep your earnings or to teach your children or to live a particular lifestyle, then it's okay to do so. It's all very proper. The game is played by the state's own rules. I maintain, on the contrary, that libertarians should breed a thorough and uncompromising disrespect for the government and its laws. We should tell people in no uncertain terms that decrees of the government have no moral legitimacy whatsoever, that they are on par with decrees of the mafia. We must work to minimize and demystify the state. Of course, there is a practical problem of avoiding penalties, and individuals may choose to obey particular laws in order to escape punishment. But a government that must rely entirely on fear cannot long survive. All governments must cloak themselves in legitimacy in order to win the passive acquiescence of their subjects. Libertarians must seek to dissolve this aura of legitimacy. We must tell people, you have certain rights, period, and what the government does cannot change that. The government is a thug and a thief. Be on your guard. Watch it with caution, for it is powerful. But do not be awed by it. Do not grant it respect or moral sanction. Treat it as you would any villain. I submit that if this disrespect could be inculcated on a wide scale, we would experience a rebirth of liberty in America. Politicians would be beside themselves if only 1% of the population showed up to vote. Politicians would be a laughingstock. One law after another could be passed, and nobody would pay any attention. The government would die of neglect. This, rather than political action, is the course I would recommend to libertarians. And the likelihood of its success is no less than the prospect of dismantling the government from within. Granted, it lacks the flashy trappings of political campaigns. There would be no campaigns and media hype. It would be a quiet revolution, and one that is largely decentralized. It would entail dozens of different strategies. It would take a long time, and it wouldn't be glamorous. There would be few, if any, positions of power to fight for. It would require dedication and knowledge, but it could be deadly. This strategic vision, as I have argued, is incompatible with political action. We wish people to look elsewhere than government for their freedom. We wish them to view government with contemptuous indifference. This cannot be achieved through political action. Article 2, Voluntaryism and the Libertarian Tradition, by Karl Watner. Voluntaryism figures prominently in the libertarian tradition in three distinct ways. First, voluntaryism represents the final goal of all libertarians. After all, libertarianism is the doctrine that all the affairs of people, both public and private, should be carried out by individuals or their voluntary associations. Secondly, libertarianism is a realization about the nature of political society. The voluntarist approach rests on the crucial, theoretical insight that all tyranny and government are grounded on general popular acceptance. The primary responsibility for the existence and continuation of any political system rests on the majority of the population, who willingly acquiesce in their own subjection. Thirdly, voluntarism represents a way of achieving significant social change without resorting to politics or violent revolution. Since voluntarists realize that government rests on popular consent, they conclude that the only way to abolish government power is simply for the people at large to withdraw their consent. As a means, voluntarism calls for peaceful persuasion, education, civil disobedience, and non-violent resistance to the state. To libertarians, voluntarism thus represents a means, an end, and an insight. Only voluntary means can be used to attain the truly voluntary society, based on the insight that existing tyrannies depend on the voluntary submission of the governed. The purpose of this essay is to elucidate the history, the development, and the actual practice of these ideas within the context of the libertarian tradition. The three aspects of voluntarism mutually reinforce each other. The very goal of an all-voluntary society suggests its own means. The means are the seeds which bud into flowers and come into fruition. It is impossible to plant the seed of coercion and reap the flower of liberty. Thus, politics and government, which libertarians view as essentially coercive processes, can never legitimately be used to attain libertarian goals. The non-voluntarist always proposes to compel people to do something, usually by passing laws or electing politicians to office. These laws and officials depend upon political action and physical violence. Voluntaristic means like nonviolent resistance, for example, violate no one's rights. They only serve to nullify laws and politicians by ignoring them. Voluntarism does not require of people that they shall violently overthrow their government or ever use the electoral process to change it, but merely that they shall cease to support their government, whereupon it will fall of its own dead weight. Etienne de la Boétie, 1530 to 1563, the first libertarian political philosopher in the Western world, was largely responsible for the original statement and elaboration of the voluntarist principle. In his Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, probably written around the mid-1550s, La Boétie discussed one of the most critical problems of political philosophy, namely the question of civil obedience. Quote, "Why in the world do people consent to their own enslavement?" he asked. Quote, "Why do the bulk of the people acquiesce in their own subjection?" La Boétie answered these questions by explaining the governmental mystique created by rulers and their intellectual apologists. By relying on custom, by providing bread and circuses to the citizenry, and by creating a vast network of governmental supporters dependent on political plunder, governments were able to engineer and sustain their own popular acceptance among the populace. La Boétie's voluntarist insight that consent is brought about largely by government propaganda speaks sharply to the problem of strategy. It leads directly to the conclusion that mass civil disobedience and mass nonviolent resistance are the only true methods for overthrowing tyranny. Realizing the great value of natural liberty, La Boétie called for a thorough process of educating the public to the truth, a process which would give back to the people a knowledge of the blessings of liberty and a knowledge of the myths and illusions fostered by the state. The primary task of opponents of tyranny is an educational one, to alert the public to their despotic condition, to demystify and desanctify the entire state apparatus. La Boétie was thus the first political philosopher to move from an emphasis on the importance of consent to the strategic importance of toppling tyranny by leading the public to withdraw their consent. The value of La Boétie's insights were somewhat lost to the 16th and 17th century English, yet voluntarism played a significant part in the struggle between church and state during these centuries. During the mid-17th century, the English independents were moving towards a completely voluntaristic concept of the church. They considered that maintenance of churches by tithes and state support ought to be done away with. This was no new idea, and for a long period there had been independents who realized that this was the logical outcome of their views of separation of church and state. For example, a petition circulated in London in 1647 demanded that, quote, "tithes and all other enforced maintenance may be forever abolished, and nothing in the place thereof imposed, but that all ministers be paid only by those who voluntarily choose them and contract with them for their labors." By substituting taxes for tithes and governmental officials for ministers, we realize how close these early religious dissenters were to espousing the ideas of a truly voluntary state. The early advocates of church-state separation were in the vanguard of the libertarian tradition because they took one of the first steps necessary to separate the state from all the rest of society. In these religious controversies, the term voluntaryism was representative of those who advocated complete separation of church and state. The term itself came into common usage during the extensive disputes between the churchmen and dissenters in Scotland during the second decade of the 19th century. It was then picked up by the English nonconformists during the 1830s and applied to their agitation to keep the English government out of the educational process. The voluntary educationists saw a religious threat in state-controlled education, and many believed that the law of supply and demand, or the voluntary principle as they termed it, would provide for the education of the whole English people. Aubrey Herbert attempted to repopularize the term during the 1880s and the 1890s in his voluntarist journal, Free Life. William Godwin, author of An Inquiry Concerning Political Justice in 1793, offers a good example of voluntaristic thinking in the late 18th century England. It is interesting to note that the revolutionary violence never became a serious threat to England because of the influence of the religious nonconformist teachings among the working classes. Godwin, among other extreme political thinkers of that era, believed that physical force was too uncertain in its results and that peaceful resistance was more desirable and effective. Godwin argued for reasonable discussion and disciplined non-cooperation as the means of fighting against authority. In Political Justice, Book 2, Chapter 3, and Book 4, Chapter 1, he urged that, quote, "all government is founded in opinion. Men at present live under any particular form because they conceive it their interest to do so. Destroy this opinion, and the fabric which is built upon it falls to the ground. Make men wise, and by that very operation you make them free. Civil liberty follows as a consequence of this. No usurped power can stand against the artillery of opinion. Godwin, in one important particular, was at variance with the main tradition of dissent in the 18th century. A large body of dissenters thought in terms of politics. They tended to see problems as political and to seek political solutions. They favored associations and the normal methods of bringing political pressure to bear. They looked to legislative action for a solution of problems. Godwin, on the other hand, looked only to the reformation of the individual, objected to political parties, and had no faith in political solutions of what were for him simply moral problems. The voluntaristic dissenters believed that moral agitation was always more effective and more proper than political activity. The 19th century abolitionists, both in England and the United States, struggling to abolish slavery and the slave trade, were faced with similar problems. Was slaveholding to be abolished by moral suasion or political means? Should abolitionists participate in party politics, or should they hold aloof from such controversies? Should they create their own third-party organizations to propagate the abolition of slavery? The radical abolitionists were on the cutting edge of the libertarian movement because they viewed slavery as the worst form of stealing. Slavery was called man-stealing because it reflected the theft of a person's self-ownership rights. The problems faced by the 19th century abolitionists, both in terms of goals and strategies, have much to say about the place of voluntarism in the libertarian movement today. William Lloyd Garrison led one wing of the abolitionist movement, and it is his views which we shall first examine. By the mid-1840s, Garrison and his chief lieutenants, Wendell Phillips and Henry Clark Wright, had come to the conclusion that all office holding and voting was wrong and morally reprehensible. These men arrived at their views in two different ways. During the 1830s, Garrison had addressed himself to the issues of perfectionism and non-resistance. He and his fellow non-resistants rejected not only war, but the entire apparatus that sustained government and power. He summarized their position in the 1938 Declaration of Sentiments adopted by the Peace Convention held in Boston that year. Non-resistants renounced all allegiance to human governments and disabled themselves from holding any political office. This carried with it a rejection of voting. Quote, "If we cannot occupy a seat in the legislature or on the bench, neither can we elect others to act as our substitutes in any such capacity." In 1841, Garrison and his followers underwent a further transformation, which led to a reinforcement of their beliefs against political action. The Liberty Party, which had been purposely formed as an anti-slavery party in 1840, appalled Garrison, both as a matter of theory and tactics. He claimed that an anti-slavery third party would split the movement and dilute anti-slavery principles by dragging them into the political gutter. Nearly at the same time, the Garrisonians came to the realization that the Constitution was actually a pro-slavery document and that disunion should be the rule of the day. They came to see the Constitution as, quote, "a covenant with death and an agreement with hell," end quote, and therefore advocated personal disallegiance from the federal government and sectional disunion from the South. This outlook on the Constitution was only developed after the Garrisonians had been preaching their non-resistance and no-voting theories for a number of years. Since Garrison took all of these demands seriously, he came to condemn voting not only for all non-resistants, but for all enfranchised citizens. He took the ground that to vote for any public officer, local, state, or federal, would be to endorse someone who would have to take an oath to uphold the United States Constitution, which supported slavery. Any act of allegiance to a government whose Constitution supported slavery, quote, "means either to undertake or execute the law which I think wrong, or to appoint another to do so," end quote, for me. The Garrisonian ideas were propagated in many forums. Garrison himself engaged in a debate with James Birney, soon to be head of the Liberty Party, in the late 1830s. In this Letter on the Political Obligations of Abolitionists, Garrison maintained that the political reformation which would bring about the abolition of slavery, quote, "is to be expected solely by a change in the moral vision of the people, not by attempting to prove that it is the duty of every abolitionist to be a voter, but that it is the duty of every voter to be an abolitionist," end quote. It was, in his opinion, the general object of the anti-slavery movement to so, quote, "affect public sentiment, and after the views and feelings of the people in regard to the crime of slaveholding, that all classes of society may be induced to rally together en masse for the entire abolition of slavery," end quote. Garrison's field was not the field of political action, but that of moral suasion. In seeking to reform public sentiment that lay behind laws and constitutions, Garrison was striking at the heart of the problem. Both of Garrison's chief helpers, Phillips and Wright, independently expressed their anti-political views. Phillips wrote of his no voting theory in The Liberator in 1844, and then further clarified his views in his 1845 pamphlet, Can Abolitionists Vote or Take Office Under the United States Constitution? Henry Clark Wright had earlier formulated his views in his 1841 booklet on Ballot Box and Battlefield. Wright maintained the non-resistant position, claiming that the ballot box was at most only a makeshift substitute for the violence of bullets on the battlefield. According to his lights, no man could honestly accept the office of voter and then vote against the existence of government. Quote, May a man consent to be invested with power to do an evil and swear to do it, even for the purpose of abolishing that evil, he asked. Wright claimed that a man may never rightfully consent to do what he thinks wrong. He who would do it proves himself dishonest. Quote, He consents to be vested with power to do what he acknowledges to be wrong and swears to do it, and then gravely assures us that he never intended to do it. Such a man is unworthy of any trust. End quote. Thus, Wright concluded the fact that any man, knowing the nature and duties of a congressman or president, quote, will consent to hold these offices is of itself sufficient evidence that he is not a true and good man. End quote. Wright summarizes his arguments by stating that he would not vote, even if by his one vote he could free all the slaves. Wendell Phillips, in his consideration of the question, Can abolitionists vote or take office under the Constitution, came to a very simple conclusion, namely that they could not. The position of non-voter and conscientious objector to the government was to be jealously guarded. In a land where the ballot is idolized, the non-voter, quote, kindles in every beholder's bosom something of the warm sympathy which waits on the persecuted, carries with it all the weight of a disinterested testimony to truth, and pricks each voter's conscience with an uneasy doubt, whether after all voting is right. There is constantly a Mordecai in the gate. End quote. Phillips sustained his claim that, quote, it is by no means necessary that every man should actually vote in order to influence his times, by citing the historical examples of conscientious objectors who wielded a moral influence widely disproportionate to their numbers. Other wings of the radical abolitionist movement supported the no-voting stance taken by the Garrisonians. Nathaniel Peabody Rogers, longtime editor of the New Hampshire Anti-Slavery Society journal, Herald of Freedom, noted that men in this country have been brought up to believe that nothing can be accomplished except by political methods. They cannot understand how any sane mind can discern any other way to any end. End quote. The only object of party politics for Rogers was power. Quote, to get it or preserve it is the only possible motive. End quote. Rogers realized that the vote which a man casts is but a very insignificant emblem of his political power. Quote, the influence which goes out from every man, whether for good or evil, can be but very imperfectly measured by the standards of a ballot. What he seems to lose by the withdrawal of his single vote is gained 100-fold in the increased force which is given to the testimony of the lips and of the life by that disinterested act. We only know that we are following the dictates of plain practical common sense in refusing to commit what we see to be a crime in order to extirpate another crime. We will not consent to obtain power by false pretenses, even for the purpose of abolishing slavery. End quote. Rogers realized the futility of gaining power temporarily, for what can be voted up today may be voted down tomorrow. Lysander Spooner was another radical abolitionist who totally rejected voting and political party activity. Prior to the Civil War, Spooner had been asked to lend his support to the Liberty Party. He refused in no uncertain terms in his letter of March 12, 1856. Quote, I feel at liberty standing outside of the Constitution and knowing that government of some kind will be carried on in the name of the Constitution, to interpret the Constitution on those points wherein it is right, and then appeal to those who profess to be governed by it to act up to their own standard. I do this on the same principle that, standing outside the Mohammedan religion, I should feel at liberty to interpret the Quran and appeal to believers to act up to their own creed, wherein it was right. It is on this ground that I write about the Constitution, and not because I ever intend to take any part, directly or indirectly, in administering it. I think no robbery is more flagrant or palpable, nor hardly any more unjustifiable, than taxing men for the support of government, without their personal consent. Such taxation is not only robbery in itself, but it supplies the means for and is the legitimate parent of nearly all the other tyranny which governments practice. You will see, therefore, that it is impossible for me to support any government that acts on that principle or to act with any party that adopts it. End quote. Spooner echoed Henry Clark Wright's analysis of voting and consent. Wright wrote that, quote, when a man consents to receive and exercise the right of suffrage, he consents that a majority shall rule and pledges himself to aid in executing the will of that majority. Whether he votes with a majority or not, by consenting to vote at all, he becomes responsible for whatever it does, end quote. Spooner wrote, quote, I would advocate natural law and constitutional law wherever I could get an audience to listen, because all men in office and out of office are bound by them without regard to minorities or majorities among the people. But I do not rely on political machinery, although it may or may not do good, according as its objects are or are not legal and constitutional. But I do not rely upon it as such, because the principle of it is wrong. For it admits, and this is my objection to it, that even under a constitution, the law depends upon the will of majorities, for the time being, as indicated by the acts of the legislature. It admits the rights of majorities, even under a constitution which purports to fix men's rights, to make and unmake laws at pleasure, or at least with very little limitation, end quote. After the Civil War, Spooner wrote in his No Treason pamphlets that voting and tax-paying were not legal evidence of assent to the Constitution. Both were done under duress and were, in effect, acts of self-defense. Spooner never maintained that people should vote or that voting was proper. Rather, he argued that when and if people vote, their acts were not to be interpreted as unquestioning obedience to the Constitution. Spooner eventually concluded that no one should have the right to vote or make laws. Quote, no human being, nor any number of human beings, have any right to make laws and compel other human beings to obey them. To say that they have is to say that they are masters and owners of those whom they require obedience, end quote. In the final analysis, Spooner rejected the Constitution and politics entirely. Quote, this much is certain. The Constitution has either authorized such a government as we have had, or has been powerless to prevent it. In either case, it is unfit to exist. End quote. Henry David Thoreau, the most famous civil resistant, was most sympathetic to the abolitionist cause. Thoreau was influenced by his friendship with Ralph Waldo Emerson, who in turn was an admirer of William Lloyd Garrison. All three shared in common the idea of individual conscience standing in opposition to the state. The core of Thoreau's argument is that men become machines when they obey orders without thinking or when they give the government authority to speak or act on their behalf. Quote, must the citizen resign his conscience to the legislator, Thoreau asked. Why has every man a conscience then? I think that we should be men first. It is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law so much as for the right. Law never made a man a whit more just, and by means of their respect for it, even the well-disposed are daily made the agents of injustice, end quote. Thoreau was speaking out against slavery as well as against the American invasion of Mexico, which took place in 1846. Thoreau was particularly outspoken against voting. He saw voting as a sort of gaming. Quote, the character of the voters is not staked. Even voting for the right is doing nothing for it. A wise man will not leave the right to the mercy of chance, nor wish it to prevail through the power of the majority. There is but little virtue in the action of masses of men, end quote. Thoreau recognized the importance of civil disobedience, both as an individual moral statement and tactical position. Referring to his own short imprisonment and his influence, Thoreau wrote, quote, if any think that their influence would be lost in prison, and their voices no longer afflict the ear of the state, they do not know how much truth is stronger than error, nor how much more eloquently and effectively he can combat injustice who has experienced a little in his own person, end quote. Adopting La Boétie's strategic outlook, he then wrote, quote, cast your whole vote, not a strip of paper merely, but your influence. A minority is powerless while it conforms to the majority. It is not even a minority then, but it is irresistible when it clogs by its own weight. If 1,000 men were not to pay their tax bills this year, that would not be a violent and bloody measure, as it would be to pay them, and enable the state to commit violence and shed innocent blood. This is, in fact, the definition of a peaceable revolution, if any such is possible. If the tax gatherer or any other public officer asks me, as one has done, but what shall I do? My answer is, if you really wish to do anything, resign your office. When the subject has refused allegiance and the officer has resigned his office, then the revolution is accomplished. End quote. Thus concludes our brief survey of voluntaryism in the libertarian tradition. Voluntaryism in the hands of 20th century libertarians has a revolutionary potential that has not been adequately recognized. If we wish to remain true to our libertarian heritage, it is clear that voluntaryism as a means, an end, and an insight deserves our support at this time. Article number 3, Demystifying the State by Wendy McElroy. Mystification is the process by which the commonplace is elevated to the level of the divine by those who have a vested interest in its unassailability. Government is a perfect example of mystification at work. Government is a group of individuals organized for the purpose of extracting wealth and exerting power over people and resources in a given geographic area. Ordinarily, people object to and resist thieves and robbers. But in the case of government, they do not, because the government has created a mystique of legitimacy about its activities. William Godwin wrote, quote, "Government is founded on opinion. A nation must have learned to respect a king before a king can exercise any authority over them," end quote. Past governments used the divine right of kings, by which monarchs claimed the divinity of being appointed to rule by God as a means of instilling this respect. Rebellion against the king became rebellion against the will of God. Contemporary governments have replaced this with the legitimacy derived from such concepts as democracy, equality, the motherland, or the American way of life. Such patriotic concepts have the ability to rouse feelings of awe and reverence in the population. These reactions are ingenuously channeled to support the government, and in turn help create the mystique of legitimacy which governments need to survive. In a libertarian context, the issue of state legitimacy reduces to one question. Does any individual or group have the right to initiate force? For the libertarian, it is always illegitimate to initiate force against non-aggressors. Libertarianism is the political philosophy based on the concept of self-ownership. That is, every human being, simply by being a human being, has moral justification over his or her own body. This jurisdiction, which is called individual rights, cannot properly be violated, for this would be tantamount to claiming that human beings are not self-owners. If individuals cannot properly violate rights, then it cannot be proper for any organization or group of individuals to do so. Certainly, the number of people involved in initiating aggression has no bearing on whether or not the violation of rights is legitimate. This is clearly pointed out by a 17th century libertarian who wrote, quote, "What can be more absurd in nature and contrary to all common sense than to call him thief and kill him that comes along with a few to rob me, and to call him Lord Protector and obey him that robs me with regiments of troops? As if to rove with 2 or 3 ships were to be a pirate, but with 50 an admiral. But if it be the number of adherents only, not the cause, that makes the difference between a robber and a protector, I will that number were defined, that the prince begins, and be able to distinguish between a robbery and a tax." Without a doubt, the most effective method by which the state creates a mystique is through control of education. The evolution of compulsory state-controlled schooling reads like a history of political maneuvering, in which the goal of teaching children literacy skills plays a minor role. Public education is by no means inept or disordered as it is made out to be. It is an ice-cold, superb machine designed to perform one very important job. The problem is not that the public schools do not work well, but rather that they do. The first goal and primary function of schools is not to educate good people, but good citizens. It is the function which we normally label state indoctrination. The early supporters of state education understood this. Horace Mann, for example, a 19th century supporter of public education, saw it as a means of assimilating foreign elements into an otherwise established Protestant Puritan culture. With regard to the Irish Catholics, Mann maintained, quote, "With the old, not much can be done, but with their children, the great remedy is education. The rising generation must be taught as our children are taught. We say must be, because in many cases this can only be accomplished by coercion. Children must be gathered up and forced into schools, and those who resist and impede this plan, whether parents or priests, must be held accountable and punished." End quote. From their inception, public schools were a form of social control. One Irish newspaper, which represented these children's being unwillingly assimilated, observed, quote, "The general principle upon which these compulsory schooling laws are based is radically unsound, untrue, and atheistical. It is that the education of children is not the work of the church or of the family, but that it is the work of the state." End quote. In contrast to the xenophobic fever with which many Native Americans rushed to impose their cultural preferences upon immigrants, libertarians condemned state schools. Josiah Warren compared them to, quote, "paying the fox to take care of the chickens," end quote. He realized that state control of education, like state control of religion, would create an orthodoxy which would suppress dissenting views. It would become a bureaucracy to serve the interest of the bureaucrats and those who ultimately controlled the state apparatus. When the statists insisted that compulsory, regulated education was necessary because people could not distinguish truth from falsehood and might be led astray, Herbert Spencer counted, quote, "There is hardly a single department of life over which, for similar reasons, legislative supervision has not been nor may be established." End quote. Today, the ideal of social control through education has been realized. Like Pavlovian dogs, children enter and exit schools to the sound of bells. They begin each day by pledging allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and by singing the national anthem. Through political science and history classes, which present severely slanted history, they are taught to revere democracy and the Constitution. School is the 12-year sentence during which children are molded into good citizens. Indeed, as we have seen, the chief function of education is to train obedient citizens. Historian Joel Spring commented, quote, "It is inevitable that compulsory state-regulated schooling will reflect the philosophy of the status quo. It is, after all, those who have political and social power who gain the most benefit from the existing political climate and depend on its continuation." End quote. In practical terms, the public school system has assumed the role of an official church by imbuing its subjects with a genuflecting respect for the state. The state projects an image of massive strength, the image of a self-perpetuating, self-contained institution upon whose goodwill the people depend. In fact, the reverse is true. Government rests upon the goodwill of the people. Without their support, it becomes fragile and will eventually disintegrate. A government is no more powerful than the human resources, the skills, the knowledge, and attitudes of obedience that it commands. Every dollar the state spends has been taken from an individual. It has no resources of its own. Every law it maintains is enforced by an individual. As Etienne de la Boétie observed of the state, quote, "He who abuses you so has only 2 eyes, has only 2 hands, 1 body, and has naught but what the least man, except for the advantages you give him to destroy." That advantage is what we call the sanction of the victim, or the consent which the oppressed must give to their oppressors. Libertarianism is a direct attack upon the mystique of the state. It recognizes that the state is only an abstraction and reduces it to the actions of individuals. It applies the same standard of morality to the state as it would to a next-door neighbor. If it is not proper for a neighbor to tax or pass laws regulating your private life, then it cannot be proper for the state to do so. Only by elevating itself above the standards of personal morality can the state make these claims on your life. Conservatives and liberals demand different varieties of law and order without regard to the fact that the ultimate in order may be found in a concentration camp. On the surface, it might seem that conservatives and liberals are engaged in deadly combat, but they're actually in fundamental agreement on one crucial methodological point, namely that the state is a proper means of achieving social change, that the use of force legitimized by the state is a proper way of controlling other people's peaceful activities. This is their fundamental disagreement with libertarianism. William Godwin formulated the libertarian rejection of force in epistemological terms. Quote, "Force is an expedient, the use of which must be deplored. It is contrary to the intellect, which cannot be improved but by conviction and persuasion. Violence corrupts the man who employs it and the man upon whom it is employed." The battle against statism today is not a battle against any particular politician. The issue is deeper. It is a battle against a way of thinking, a way of viewing the state. The main victory of the state has been within the minds of the people who obey. In commenting on the British rule over India, Leo Tolstoy wrote, quote, "A commercial company enslaves a nation comprising 200 million. Tell this to a man free from superstition, and he will fail to grasp what those words mean. What does it mean that 30,000 men have subdued 200 million? Do the figures make clear that it is not the English who have enslaved the Indians, but the Indians who have enslaved themselves? People today enslave themselves when all that freedom requires is the word no." Article number 4, A Voluntarist Bibliography, Annotated, by Carl Watner. General introduction and purpose of this bibliography. The Voluntarists are a newly formed group of libertarians who have organized to promote non-political strategies to achieve a free society. We have chosen to label ourselves Voluntarists because the term libertarian has become too closely associated with the Libertarian Party. We believe that all efforts to elect libertarians to political office conflict with libertarian principles and that such efforts are strategically unsound. Engaging in political action, running candidates for office, and encouraging people to vote must inevitably sabotage the voluntarist goal of delegitimizing the state. The only long-range and lasting way to curtail state power is to dissolve the illusion of legitimacy which all states must have in order to sustain themselves. Libertarians must come to act consistently with the voluntarist insight that all state power ultimately depends on the sanction and cooperation of its victims. The voluntarist insight. The voluntarist insight that all state power is grounded on general popular acceptance was first formulated by Etienne de la Boétie, 1530 to 1563. In his discourse on voluntary servitude, which was probably written during the 1550s, Laboisi discussed one of the most critical problems of political philosophy, namely the question of civil disobedience. Quote, "Why in the world do people consent to their own enslavement?" he asked. Quote, "Why do the bulk of the people acquiesce in their own subjection?" End quote. Laboisi answered these questions by explaining the governmental mystique created by the rulers and their intellectual apologists. By relying on custom, by providing both bread and circuses to the citizenry, and by creating a vast network of governmental supporters dependent on political plunder, governments were able to engineer and sustain their own popular acceptance among the populace. Laboisi was also the first political philosopher to move from an emphasis on the importance of consent to the strategic question of toppling tyranny by leading the public to withdraw their consent. He saw that violence was not necessary. Quote, "Obviously there is no need of fighting to overcome the tyrant, for he is automatically defeated if the country refuses to consent to its own enslavement. It is not necessary to deprive him of anything, but simply to give him nothing. It is therefore the inhabitants themselves who permit, or rather bring about, their own subjection, since by ceasing to submit, they would put an end to their servitude." End quote. Realizing the great value of natural liberty, Laboisi called for a thorough process of educating the public to the truth, a process which would give back to the people a knowledge of the myths and illusions fostered by the state. The primary tasks of the opponents of state power is therefore an educational one, to alert the public to their despotic condition and then to demystify and desanctify the entire state apparatus. There are 2 English-language editions of Laboisi's essay readily available. The best, and the one quoted from above, was prepared by Free Life Editions of New York in 1975 with the title of The Politics of Obedience, the Discourse of Voluntary Servitude. Despite his advocacy of libertarian political activity, Murray Rothbard's introduction to this edition, The Political Thought of Etienne de Laboisi, gives a great deal of support to the voluntarist critique of political action. Political activity not only unnecessarily reinforces the image of state legitimacy, which, as Laboisi pointed out, we must destroy, but it is also unlikely to end state power. Laboisi's analysis implies that educational activities and nonviolent resistance to the state, such as occurred in India during the Gandhian campaigns against the British, are sufficient to topple states. The other edition of the discourse was prepared by William Flygare and is accompanied by a preface from James Barton. It is titled The Will to Bondage. Included is the original French version of the essay, alongside the first English translation, which was prepared in 1735. The Free Life edition carries a 1942 translation, so it's worthwhile to compare the two. There is not a great deal of secondary material concerning Laboisi and his discourse in English. The 2 best general discussions have been prepared by Noneril O. Coahane and James Brown Scott. Scott includes a chapter entitled La Contre un de Laboisi, Tyrannicide Through the Ages, in his The Catholic Conception of International Law. Laboisi's essay is treated as part of the historical tradition of tyrannicide. Scott refers to it as, quote, "a literary exercise in behalf of liberty in which he condemns tyranny in any and all of its forms as ruinous alike to the tyrant, the state, and the people," end quote. He aptly summarizes Laboisi's position. Quote, "He does not require of the people that they shall violently overthrow the tyrant, but merely that they shall cease to support him, whereupon he will fall of his own dead weight," end quote. Keohane's discussion of Laboisi originally appeared as the Radical Humanism of Etienne de Laboisi, and then was condensed for his book Philosophy and the State in France, The Renaissance to the Enlightenment, as On Voluntary Servitude, Laboisi. Keohane places Laboisi in the historical perspective of 16th century France by pointing out that Laboisi was both a lawyer and member of parliament. Despite his place in the state apparatus, Keohane regards Laboisi's premises as basically anarchistic, because they lead to the conclusion that no man or group of men should have authority over other individuals. In his newly published The Ethics of Liberty, Murray Rothbard devotes some space to the voluntarist insight in his chapter on the nature of the state. The latter half of this chapter deals explicitly with Laboisi and generally discusses the significance of state legitimacy. Rothbard shows how the state has historically aligned itself with the church, and that when this became no longer possible, how the state assumed control over public education. The state is thus able to, quote, "mold the minds of its subjects," end quote, from kindergarten to graduate school in order to foster this voluntary servitude. In a footnote, Rothbard cites 2 other disparate thinkers who have understood the importance of majority consent to governmental tyranny. He quotes from David Hume's essay on the first principles of government. Hume, who was no libertarian, wrote, quote, "Nothing appears more surprising than the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and the implicit submission with which man resigns their own sentiments to those of their rulers. We shall find that, as force is always on the side of the governed, the governors have nothing to support them but opinion. It is therefore on opinion only the government is founded." Rothbard also cites Ludwig von Mises in Human Action. Voluntaryism from a historical perspective. The voluntarist insight and the general non-political approach to social change, which it suggests has a long-standing place in the libertarian tradition. For a general discussion, see Voluntaryism in the Libertarian Tradition by Karl Watner. Any late 19th century encyclopedia should have an entry under voluntarism, since the term originated back in the early 1820s, when it was used in the religious disputes between established churchmen in England and the dissenters. Typical of such articles is the one found in Chambers' Encyclopedia. During the 1830s and until the 1850s, the term voluntarism was applied to the advocates of private schools in England. These voluntary educationists saw a religious threat in state-controlled education, and many believed that the law of supply and demand, or the voluntary principle as they termed it, would provide for the education of the whole English people. Edward Meall, a well-known publisher and dissenter, wrote a book entitled Views of the Voluntary Principle, which characterized the meaning of voluntarism for mid-19th century England. Auberon Hebert attempted to repopularize the term voluntarism during the 1880s and 1890s in his voluntarist journal Free Life. Hebert was a supporter of voluntary taxation, and one of the last projects of his life was the preparation and publication of A Plea for Voluntarism, which appeared in the Voluntarist Creed. Both the plea and the principles of voluntarism in Free Life by an American supporter of Hebert have been reprinted in Eric Mack's collection The Right and Wrong of State Compulsion and other essays by Auberon Hebert. Another classical example of voluntarism at work in England is to be found in William Godwin's Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, which first appeared in 1793. The best introduction to Godwin is found in the 1946 reprint edition by F.E.L. Priestley. Godwin believed that physical force was too uncertain, and that peaceful resistance to tyrannical government was more desirable and effective. Godwin argued for reasonable discussion and disciplined non-cooperation as the means of fighting authority. In Book 2, Chapter 3, and Book 4, Chapter 1, he urged that, quote, "All government is founded on opinion. Men at present live under any particular form because they conceive it in their interest to do so. Destroy this opinion, and the fabric which is built upon it falls to the ground. Make men wise, and by that very operation you make them free. Civil liberty follows as a consequence of this. No usurped power can stand against the artillery of opinion." Godwin, in one important particular, was at variance with the main tradition of dissent in the 18th century. A large body of dissenters thought in terms of politics. They tended to see problems as political and to seek political solutions. They favored associations and the normal methods of bringing political pressure to bear. They looked to legislative action for a solution of problems. Godwin, on the other hand, looked only to the reformation of the individual, objected to political parties, and had no faith in political solutions of what were for him simply moral problems. The voluntaristic dissenters believed that moral agitation was always more effective and more proper than political activity. The 19th century abolitionists, both in England and the United States, struggling to abolish slavery and the slave trade, were faced with similar problems. Was slaveholding to be abolished by moral suasion or political means? Should abolitionists participate in party politics, or should they hold aloof from such controversies? Should they create their own organizations to propagate the abolition of slavery? Should they use political action to achieve their goals? The problems faced by the 19th century abolitionists were very similar to the ones faced by 20th century libertarians in their struggle to achieve a free society. William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, and Henry Clark Wright were the leaders of the radical abolitionist movement in America. These men and their followers in the New England non-resistance society held that all office holding and voting was morally wrong and reprehensible. Ultimately, the Garrisonians came to see the Constitution as a document which supported slavery and one to which they could not swear personal allegiance. These abolitionists suggested many of the arguments used by anti-political libertarians today. For example, they raised the issue of personal integrity. How could any abolitionist, read Libertarian, accept a government salary or swear a public oath of allegiance to the Constitution or uphold laws which violate personal liberty? Garrison argued that political parties alter one's fundamental outlook towards the state. The Liberty Party, which had been purposely formed as an anti-slavery party in 1840, appalled Garrison, both as a matter of theory and of tactics. He claimed that an anti-slavery party would split the movement and dilute anti-slavery principles by dragging them into the political gutter. The Garrisonian ideas were propagated in many forums. Garrison engaged in a debate with James Birney, soon to be head of the Liberty Party in the 1830s. In their A Letter to the Political Obligations of Abolitionists, Garrison argued that moral suasion, not political action, was needed to reform public sentiment. Both of Garrison's chief helpers, Phillips and Wright, independently expressed their anti-political views. Wright authored a small book entitled Ballot Box and Battlefield, which he claimed that the ballot box was only a makeshift substitute for the violence of bullets on the battlefield. Wright held that no man could honestly undertake to become a voter and then vote against the existence of government. Quote, "May a man consent to be invested with power to do an evil?" he asked. Wright claimed that a man may never rightfully consent to do what he thinks wrong. He who would do so proves himself dishonest. Quote, "He consents to be vested with power to do what he acknowledges to be wrong and swears to do it. Such a man is unworthy of any trust." End quote. Thus, Wright concluded the fact that any man, knowing the nature and duties of a congressman or president, quote, "will consent to hold these offices is of itself sufficient evidence that he is not a true and good man." End quote. Wright summarized his arguments by stating that he would not vote, even if by his one vote he could free all the slaves. Wendell Phillips considered the question, can an abolitionist vote or take office under the United States Constitution, and concluded quite straightforwardly that they could not. The secondary literature dealing with the abolitionist position on voting is quite extensive and certainly much easier to locate than some of the primary materials. Two standard discussions of the voting controversy can be found in Eileen Creditor, Means and Ends in American Abolitionism, and in Lewis Perry, Radical Abolitionism, Anarchy, and the Government of God in Anti-Slavery Thought. Another excellent discussion of the Garrisonian critique of politics can be found in William Weissach, The Sources of Anti-Slavery Constitutionalism in America. Some of Henry Clark Wright's writings, as well as excerpts from the Garrison-Birney Exchange, can be found in Truman Nelson's Documents of Upheaval, selections from William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, 1831 to 1865. Another very interesting aspect of the abolitionist movement is to be found in the writings of Henry David Thoreau and his close friend Charles Lane. Lane was an Englishman, attracted to this country through his friendship with Bronson Alcott, another close friend of Thoreau. Both Alcott and Lane were arrested for refusal to pay their town taxes, and their examples served to spur Thoreau onto his well-known example of tax resistance. All three were opposed to voting and made their views widely known. Lane wrote an extensive series of letters which appeared in Garrison's The Liberator in 1843. They were entitled A Voluntary Political Government and had been recently reprinted. In the letters, Lane advocated a totally voluntary, anarchistic society. Lane's aversion to politics is apparent in many of the letters, and he realized that governmental control rests on the acquiescence of the citizenry. Quote, "The mixture of education with politics," by which he meant public schooling, "is only a contrivance to gild the iron chains by which men are so despotically bound." End quote. In his third letter, Lane urged us to go as far as possible from human governments. Participation in politics is evil. Quote, "Like all of our enemies, state oppression will die of itself if we meddle not with it," end quote, and do not support it. Disown the government and do not support it with your taxes. Enlighten the oppressed as to their own self-imposed servitude, but stay away from the state, for it will only contaminate you. The similarity between Lane's answer and Thoreau's solution and Thoreau's own resistance to civil government is quite striking. Quote, "When the subject has refused allegiance and the officer has resigned his office, then the revolution is accomplished." End quote. Lysander Spooner, the famous individualist anarchist and constitutional lawyer, also played a prominent role in the abolitionist movement. Before he evolved into an outright anarchist, Spooner wrote some trenchant and logical attacks against the Garrisonian claim that the Constitution supported slavery. These are reprinted in the collected works of Lysander Spooner and appear as The Unconstitutionality of Slavery. Spooner's famous An Essay on Trial by Jury and his attacks on the fugitive slave law were all written to show why the common law, when uncorrupted by state legislation, upheld individual rights and destroyed slavery. There are some brilliant passages in all these works upholding natural rights and especially the rights of all citizens to resist unjust acts of oppression perpetrated by the government. After the Civil War, and as a result of having lived through a domestic rebellion in which all the ideas of the American Revolution were totally ignored, Spooner became an anarchist. In his No Treason series, Spooner showed that the U.S. government could not claim either voting or tax paying as proof that individuals consented to the government. Neither were evidence of any single person's consent to the Constitution as a legal document. Spooner claimed that both paying taxes and voting were done under indirect threats, and therefore would be construed as acts of self-defense. However, Spooner never maintained that the people should vote, or that voting was proper, or that he personally would ever take part in the political process. Rather, he argued that when and if people vote, their actions were not to be interpreted as evidence that they actually supported the Constitution. Spooner eventually concluded that no one should have the right to vote or make laws. Quote, "No human being, nor any number of human beings, have any right to make laws, and compel other human beings to obey them. To say that they have is to say that they are masters and owners of those whom they require such obedience." End quote. Spooner's final conclusions on voting were expressed in his piece, Against Woman Suffrage, which was reprinted in Benjamin Tucker's Liberty, and in Rampart Individualist. Many other 19th century individualist anarchists supported Spooner's position against political involvement. Josiah Warren, for example, one of the earliest American anarchists, rejected politics and engaged in a lifelong quest for the development of anarchist communities. Benjamin Tucker, the student of both Warren and Spooner, and editor of the famous journal Liberty, compiled his views on anarchist methods in a section of his book titled Instead of a Book. The best of Tucker's anti-political views are presented in a short editorial called The Method of Anarchy. Tucker advocated passive resistance as the superior alternative to either ballots or violent revolution. Referring to the voluntarist insight, Tucker claimed that passive resistance, which hereafter shall be referred to as nonviolent resistance, was the most potent weapon ever wielded by man against oppression. Quote, "Power feeds on its spoils and dies when its victims refuse to be despoiled. They can't persuade it to death. They can't vote it to death. They can't shoot it to death, but they can always starve it to death. When a determined body of people, sufficiently strong in numbers and force of character to command respect and make it unsafe to imprison them, shall agree to quietly close their doors in the face of the tax collector, government will go by the board." End quote. Tucker cited the near success of the Irish Land League and No Rent movement in Ireland as examples of nonviolent resistance campaigns. Francis Tandy, a follower of Tucker, in his chapter on methods in voluntary socialism, reiterated the strength of Tucker's argument for nonviolent resistance. Quote, "To gain anything by political methods, it is first necessary to gain a majority of the votes cast, and even then you have to trust the integrity of the men elected to office. But with nonviolent resistance, this is unnecessary. A strong, determined, and intelligent minority, employing methods of nonviolent resistance, would be able to carry all before it." End quote. Tandy astutely pointed out the important relationships between means and ends in libertarian thought. Quote, "Nonviolent resistance can never pass a law. It can only nullify laws. Consequently, it can never be used as a means of coercion, and is particularly adapted to the attainment of anarchy. All other schools of reform propose to compel people to do something. For this, they must resort to force, usually by passing laws. These laws depend upon political action for their inauguration and physical violence for their enforcement. Anarchists are the only reformers who do not advocate physical violence. Tyranny must ever depend upon the weapon of tyranny, but freedom can be inaugurated only by means of freedom." End quote. Tandy realized that when nonviolent resistance is practiced, attention is drawn to its underlying principles. Quote, "Thus education and nonviolent resistance go hand in hand and help each other step by step towards the goal of human freedom." End quote. A good discussion of late 19th century individualist anarchist strategy will appear in the forthcoming Liberty Centennial volume in the chapter by Morgan Edwards, Neither Bombs Nor Ballots, Benjamin Tucker and the Strategy of Anarchism. During the first half of the 20th century, the few well-known libertarians actually followed the anti-political pattern set by Spooner, Tucker, and Tandy. Albert J. Nock's overall attitude certainly precluded political action. In his essay, What the American Votes For, which originally appeared in the American Mercury of February 1933, Nock claims that the only time he ever voted, he cast a write-in ballot for Jefferson Davis on the basis that, quote, "If we can't have a live statesman, let us by all means have a first-class corpse." End quote. In his essay, Anarchist's Progress, Nock points out why it is impossible for the best-intentioned office holder not to sell out to the system. Suppose that you put a Sunday school superintendent in charge of a whorehouse. Quote, he might trim off some of the coarser fringes of the job and put things in a state of outward order and decency, end quote, but he must run a whorehouse, or he would promptly hear from the owners. The voters elect politicians to administer the state, not to destroy it. In the final analysis, Knock thought that, quote, great and salutary social transformations, such as in the end, do not cost more than they come to, are not affected by political shifts, by movements, by programs and platforms, least of all by violent revolutions, but by sound and disinterested thinking, end quote. H.L. Mencken, despite his outward appearances as a newspaperman, had some rather acerbic thoughts on the political system. His book, Prejudices, 4th series, carries 2 implicitly anti-political essays, The Politician and On Government. Mencken begins his analysis of the politician by pointing out the assumption of the great majority of American voters, that politicians are divided into 2 classes, and that one of those classes is made up of good ones. Hence, the American public thinks that every time they turn one set of politicians out of office, they will get better ones in their place. But how wrong they are, as history has proved. Quote, the primary error lies in making the false assumption that some politicians are better than others, end quote. Obviously, they are not. Quote, politics, as hopeful men practice it in the world, consist mainly of the delusion that a change in form is a change in substance, end quote. Frank Chodorov really got to the heart of the matter when he declared, quote, that the state itself, regardless of its composition, is an exploitative institution, end quote. No matter who operates a whorehouse, to use Knox's metaphor, still operates a whorehouse, and any class of politician, even if they call themselves libertarians, are still politicians. It makes little difference whether libertarians, socialists, Democrats, or Republicans are in office. The state is still nothing more than a criminal gang. In his essays on Writing and Evil and If We Quit Voting, Chodorov advocated staying away from the polls. Quote, why should a self-respecting citizen endorse an institution grounded in thievery, end quote. A voter's boycott, unlike other revolutions, but much like nonviolent resistance campaigns, quote, calls for no organization, no violence, no war fund, and no leader to sell it out, end quote. Other more recent libertarians have similarly called for mass non-participation in the electoral process. Robert Lefebvre engaged in lengthy correspondence with a number of congressional representatives and senators during 1972 in an effort to determine the legitimacy of their participation in government. Drawing much on Spooner's analysis of elected representatives, Lefebvre demonstrates in his The Power of Congress that the theory of electoral representation has no firm basis. His correspondents could not agree, quote, whether representatives should really be agents of their electors and varied widely in their interpretation of their own function and authority, end quote. Lefebvre contends that because of the secret ballot and the structure of our political institutions, elected office holders are in fact representatives of no one. They had best all pack up and go home. Cy Leon, in his None of the Above, the Lesser of Two Evils, is Evil, attacks majority rule as a violation of individual rights and opposes the political vote. Voting is wrong because it does not give individuals the right to express their true opinions about the politicians. The politicians do not dare insert None of the Above on the ballot for fear that no politician would be elected to office. Robert Ringer, in his bestseller Restoring the American Dream, cites Leon favorably and makes some telling comments about the Libertarian Party and voting in general. Quote, when you vote for a candidate, you're voting to put someone in a position to rule the lives of your fellow man. Men who either do not want that candidate to rule them or do not want anyone to rule them, end quote. He also said, quote, the most disconcerting thing about the Libertarian Party is that it is a political party, end quote. Every political party and every politician is subject to the historical law of corruption. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Among the younger generation of contemporary libertarians, Samuel Edward Konkin III and George H. Smith have led the attack against political action. Konkin's magazine New Libertarian and his Movement of the Libertarian Left have long criticized the Libertarian Party. Quote, he who serves the party serves the state, end quote, because it's impossible to destroy the system by joining it. Conklin's emphasis on counter-economics and agorism as alternatives to political strategies is set forth in his New Libertarian Manifesto. Smith, too, has tried to convey the message that politics and libertarianism are inconsistent. One of his earliest attacks on the Libertarian Party was a satirical victory speech of the Libertarian Party President-elect 1984, which appeared in Supplement 4 of New Libertarian Weekly. Smith tried to show why a libertarian president would be involved in all sorts of philosophical predicaments. How would he deal with tax evaders, drug smugglers, victims of victimless crime laws, etc.? This criticism was followed up by a seriously theoretical piece entitled Party Dialogue. His most recent foray against the LP occurred at the California LP Convention on board the Queen Elizabeth II in February of 1982. Here he continued his debate with Ant-Man under the title Political Action versus Non-Political Action, in which they exchanged their views on the validity of political action for libertarians. Smith's efforts against the LP have been instrumental in the formation of the Voluntarists, whose purpose is to spread the message that libertarianism must be propagated by non-political means. This brings to a conclusion our survey of literature which deals with the voluntarist insight and the question of anti-political and non-political activity. As can be seen from the suggestions of Tucker and Tandy, nonviolent resistance is a very useful tool for voluntarists to embrace. It is hopeful that the efforts put forth in this bibliographic essay will spark libertarians to at least investigate the merits and the demerits of nonviolent resistance, which itself has an extensive body of literature built up around it. The findings of such a study should be of great interest to all voluntarists, and we hope it is not long forthcoming. Article 5, Voluntaryism in the European Anarchist Tradition, by Karl Watner. Introduction. Voluntaryism, the doctrine that the state should be abolished through peaceful, non-electoral means, has been advocated by anarchists both in Europe and America. My earlier pamphlets, Voluntaryism in the Libertarian Tradition and a Voluntarist Bibliography, Annotated, generally dealt with the roots of the anti-electoral voluntarist tradition and its manifestations in the United States and England. This essay, however, deals primarily with the expression of this tradition by European anarchists. The picture presented here is not an exaggerated view of the anti-political nature of European anarchism, but it is one seen through a single lens. There are many other aspects and elements of European anarchism, which, although not examined here, are still important. Nevertheless, any historical judgment will credit anti-parliamentarianism as one of the most important and long-lasting aspects of the anarchist traditions, both in Europe and North America. Although Emma Goldman was a naturalized U.S. citizen, her roots were European, and many of the activities and debates she engaged in involved European affairs. Her appearance in this essay also epitomizes the difference in emphasis between individualist anarchists and collectivist anarchists. The former have approached libertarian history from the perspective of the self-ownership principle. That is, anarchists and libertarians were usually defined by their adherence to the axiom that each person is a self-owner and should control his own person and justly owned property. Within the context of English and American history, this primarily meant dealing with the radical individualists and radical abolitionists from the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. However, the European anarchist tradition never fully developed this principle of self-ownership in the same manner as the individualist anarchists in the English-speaking world. It was always anti-authoritarian and had a more collectivist orientation towards property ownership than did the individualist tradition. Anarchists of whatever persuasion always have and always will view the state as a criminal institution, as a band of thieves and robbers who violate the person and property rights of their victims. It is this anarchist insight into the nature of the state that the state is inherently and necessarily an invasive institution, which distinctly identifies the anarchist, whether individualist or collectivist. What unites them is their commonly shared view of the state as a criminal gang and the chief enemy and most dangerous enemy of all people in society. Where they differ is in their expectations regarding the form a future anarchist society will take. Since anarchism is the doctrine that all the affairs of the people should be conducted on a voluntary basis, it is up to the people who compose such a society to arrange their affairs as suits them. Many European anarchists anticipated a communal or collectivist organization of society once the state was abolished. However, as much as their future expectations differed from those of the individualists, their approach to social change was voluntarist and anti-political. Although the European anarchist tradition was often looked upon as fraught with the violence of terrorists and war, it included many non-violent revolutionaries among its ranks. As we shall see, the European experiences offer a rich buffet of historical lessons for all voluntarists today. Proudhon. Although one of the earliest popularizers of the term anarchism was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, 1809 to 1865. Another Frenchman, Anselme Balagarriga, his contemporary, was the first to publish a periodical with an explicitly anarchist title. His La Anarchie, Journal de l'Ordre, first appeared in April 1850. Bela Garriga was even more anti-electoral than Proudhon, and was explicitly nonviolent. According to him, the task of abolishing governments, quote, must be carried out neither by political parties, which will always seek to dominate, nor by violent revolution, which needs leaders like any other military operation. The people, once enlightened, will act for itself, end quote. The people will make its own revolution by the sole strength of right, the force of inertia, the refusal to cooperate. From the refusal to cooperate stems the abrogation of the laws that legalize murder and the proclamation of equity. Both Bela Garriga and Proudhon stressed the basic freedom and spontaneity of anarchism, and saw that these elements precluded the use of rigid organizations, particularly anything like a political party, which sought to seize and hold power for creating the future society. Quote, all parties, without exception, insofar as they seek for power, are varieties of absolutism, end quote, said Proudhon, and none of his followers have departed from this position. From his own personal experiences in parliamentary affairs, Proudhon came to reject parliamentary institutions because, quote, they mean that the individual abdicates his sovereignty by handing it over to a representative. Once he's done this, decisions may be reached in his name over which he no longer has any control, end quote. Proudhon opposed democratic parliaments as well as monarchs, such as Emperor Napoleon III, when he proudly declared, quote, whoever puts his hand on me to govern me is an usurper and a tyrant. I declare him my enemy, end quote. Proudhon did not begin his political career with a rejection of electoral activity, however. In 1848, he narrowly missed being elected to the Constituent Assembly, and in June of that same year, he actually was elected. There is some speculation that he ran for office with the idea of gathering support for his People's Bank, since he had already approached a government cabinet minister for assistance in promoting the project. His experience was disillusioning. Quote, as soon as I set foot on the parliamentary Sinai, I ceased to be in touch with the masses, because I was absorbed by my legislative work. I entirely lost sight of the current of events, end quote. It was soon clear that he was completely out of place in the assembly. As he recalled his election of 1848, a year afterwards, Proudhon remarked with some justification, quote, when I think of all I have written and published for 10 years on the role of the state in society, on the subordination of power, and the revolutionary incapacity of government, I am tempted to believe that my election was the effect of a misunderstanding on the part of the people, end quote. His biographer, George Woodcock, adds, quote, it seems to have been the effect of a misunderstanding on his own part as well, end quote. While still in Parliament, Proudhon was charged with sedition when he denounced Louis Napoleon. His parliamentary immunity was waived by his colleagues, and he was sentenced to 3 years in prison and a fine of 3,000 francs. Thus ended his first involvement in real politics. Years later, in 1863, when the Bonapartiste government held elections, Proudhon became the center of an anti-voting movement. Committees of abstention were set up in Paris and Bordeaux, and Proudhon penned a detailed exposition of his abstentionist arguments, which appeared in April of 1863 under the title Les Démocrates, Assertments et les Réfractaires, Oath-Taking Democrats and Non-Jurors. Despite some little success, the Committee of Abstention disbanded after the election. Quote, yet it bequeathed to the movements that followed it, and particularly to anarchism and syndicalism, at least two important elements: the rejection of expediency as a dominant element in political behavior, and the rejection of the democratic myth of the vote as a universal political panacea. Although Proudhon might not have totally rejected all forms of parliamentarianism and voting, he believed that political strategies were designed to serve the ruling classes. It is certain that his own political experiences, quote, hardened his distrust of political methods and helped to create the anti-parliamentarianism that marked his last years and was inherited by the anarchist movement in general, end quote. Besides Proudhon, there were several other European anarchists with similar electoral experiences. Karl Grun, one of the most ardent German converts of Proudhon, served, quote, a short disillusioning period as a parliamentarian in the Prussian National Assembly in 1849, end quote. Another anarchist with similar experience was the Dutchman, Ferdinand Domela Nieuwenhuis, who was also an extreme anti-militarist. He was elected to Parliament in 1888 as a socialist, and he remained there for 3 years. Like Proudhon and Grun, he found it a saddening experience and emerged a convinced anti-parliamentarian and began turning towards anarchism. This also recalls to mind the British Member of Parliament, Auberon Hebert, who evolved into a voluntarist. The anarchist dissatisfaction with electoral politics was not totally a one-way street. There were prominent anarchists who turned towards parliamentary socialism as they became disillusioned with the possibilities of achieving the anarchist revolution. Paul Broussais, 1844 to 1912, was one such personality. He had fallen under the influence of Balkanen in the early 1870s and became one of the leading exponents of the anarchist propaganda by deed, acts of violent terrorism. After 1877, he became mainly concerned with the revival of the French socialist movement. Quote, "This revival, combined with the growing isolation and ineffectiveness of the anarchists, led Broussais to change his ideas on political tactics, and when he returned to France in 1880, he had abandoned the central tenet of anarchism, abstention from the use of the vote, although he continued to believe in the ideal of anarcho-communist society. In Broussais' own case, he became disillusioned with the possibility of terror tactics winning a majority of the masses over to anarchism, and thus became willing to experiment with electoral tactics instead. However, previous to his political conversion, in 1875 he had written a pamphlet critical of universal suffrage, attacking it both on the basis of the French experience, as well as criticizing its theoretical shortcomings. In the words of his biographer, Broussais illustrated, quote, "how universal suffrage had been used throughout the century as an instrument of the bourgeoisie, while posturing as an expression of the will of the people," end quote. Broussais concluded that electoral agitation would only confirm the bourgeoisie in power. Despite his anti-electoral outpourings, Broussais swallowed his pride and turned to electoral actions when his anarchist strategies failed to bring about any immediate results. He joined with the socialists and became founder of a political party identified with the term possibilism. The possibilists had as their aim, quote, "to achieve as soon as possible the organization of public services for the immediate need of the working class. One of the ways this could be achieved was through municipal action," end quote, and politics. The choice he made was a way out of the dilemma faced by anarchists in the late 1870s and 1880s. For many saw the dogma of electoral abstention only as a tactic, and when it proved ineffective, they were ready to resort to electoral efforts or trade unionism. Syndicalism. The failure of terror tactics during the 1880s and early 1890s created a disillusionment in anarchist ranks, as we've seen. This resulted in large numbers of French anarchists becoming syndicalists and entering workers' unions. Revolutionary trade unionism, or syndicalism as it became known, was premised upon the class struggle between wage earners, the proletariat, and the state, represented by property owners and the bourgeoisie. The outcome of the class struggle would result in a social revolution and the establishment of a socialist society, in which autonomous syndicates would control each industry. The syndicates, in turn, would be controlled by the workers of that particular branch of industry and would unite in general national federations. Syndicalists thus combined the Marxian elements of class struggle and distribution according to need with the collectivist concept of property and the anarchist idea of statelessness. Syndicates were unique in that they placed a distinctive emphasis on the role of the labor union in the struggle against the state and opposed parliamentary democracy and political weapons in the class struggle. It was from the two makers of the anarchist tradition, Proudhon and Michael Bakunin, 1814 to 1876, that the French syndicalists inherited their, quote, "overpowering hatred of the centralized state, a sharp distrust of politicians, and a rudimentary concept of workers' control in industry," end quote. Imbued with strong anarchist tendencies, many of these unions came to regard the state with hostile eyes and to reject the conquest of political power. The general strike, comprising workers in all trade unions rather than political parties, was to be the primary means of achieving the social revolution. Many anarchists participated in syndicalist unions, and in fact it was their participation which largely prevented these unions from becoming subsidiary to the political parties in their respective countries. There was a clear distinction between parliamentary socialism and anarcho-syndicalism. The anarchists believed that the state could never become an instrument of emancipation, even in the hands of a socialist government. These anarchists denounced parliamentary action as, quote, "a pell-mell of compromise, of corruption, of charlatanism, and of absurdities, which does no constructive work," end quote. On the other hand, most European socialists called for the working man to participate in parliamentary life. They didn't think that political abstention was helpful or possible. The anarcho-syndicalists responded that, quote, "politics can never be the way of emancipation for the workers. You can change the form of political state, but it will still be coercive," end quote. There was always a danger of these anarchist unions being co-opted by political parties, socialist or Marxist. In 1907, a leading Italian anarchist, Enrico Malatesta, whose life and ideas will be examined in greater detail, cautioned anarchists, quote, "against entering unions infested with socialist politicians, lest they lose sight of the ultimate goal of a classless society." Fearful that syndicalism would sink into the morass of trade unionist reformism and bureaucratism, Malatesta warned his anarchist comrades not to become union officials, end quote. The distrust of parliamentary methods, particularly by the French syndicalists, was reinforced by the sellouts performed by their top leaders. Many French anarcho-syndicalists felt that they were sold out when, in 1899, Alexander Millerand accepted the post of Minister of Commerce. This anti-political bias was the confirmed policy of nearly all the syndicalist unions all over Europe. Syndicalism was best known for its advocacy of direct action and the general strike. Workmen were warned against even accepting beneficial labor legislation, since they would be reinforcing a power they wanted to destroy. Labor reform could only be obtained independently of parliamentarianism. The Italian debate. From their very beginning, anarchists had argued that parliamentary activity by socialists would corrupt their principles, and that socialist and bourgeoisie legislatures could not sincerely and effectively work for the abolition of the state. In Italy, where Bakunin had spawned an active anarchist movement, there were echoes of this dispute for many decades. Much of the Italian working class was reluctant to participate in any kind of disciplined party activity and was against any kind of parliamentary life, for the very reasons cited by the anarchists. Workers elected to office soon became renegades to their cause. These ideas and the defense of the anarchist abstentionist position were promoted by all of the prominent Italian anarchists during the last decade of the 19th century. One of them, Luigi Galliani, in his recently translated The End of Anarchism, wrote, quote, "The anarchists' electoral abstentionism implies not only a conception that is opposed to the principle of representation, which is totally rejected by anarchism, it implies, above all, an absolute lack of confidence in the state. And this distrust, which is instinctive, is for the anarchists the result of their historical experience with the state and its function. Furthermore, abstentionism has consequences which are much less superficial than the inert apathy ascribed to it. It strips the state of the constitutional fraud with which it presents itself to the gullible as the true representatives of the whole nation, and in so doing exposes its essential character as representative, procurer, and policeman of the ruling classes." End quote. Galliani's book was written as a rebuttal to Saviero Merlini. At one time a very prominent Italian anarchist and lawyer, Merlino became dissatisfied with anarchism in the late 1890s and moved closer and closer to parliamentary socialism. He eventually became a politician himself. Merlino's defection was a source of concern to those remaining within the Italian anarchist movement, and some of its leading theoreticians, like Galliani and Enrico Malatesta, engaged in long polemic discussions in order to counter the effects of Merlino's defection. Merlino had been living outside Italy until 1894, and when he returned to Naples he was arrested and imprisoned there to serve out an old sentence. He was freed in late 1896 or early 1897, and soon thereafter informed the conservative newspaper, Il Messaggero, that his political opinions had changed. This provoked a debate with Enrico Malatesta, which continued until 1898 when Malatesta was arrested. Merlino concluded that he no longer considered himself an anarchist, and would rather define himself as a libertarian socialist. Furthermore, he now approved of parliamentary action, so much so that, in agreement with other friends, he proposed to present Galliani, who was then also confined as a political prisoner, as a candidate for parliament on the Socialist Party ticket as a protest against political detention, and as a means to set him free by popular request. Galliani refused the offer. He and other anarchist prisoners published a special newspaper in which they rejected the use of electoral means, even as a way of freeing themselves. As anarchists, they wished to assert, quote, once and for all their firm refusal to compromise or in any way distort their opposition to the state, a fundamental tenet of their convictions, end quote. The front page of their paper carried an editorial signed by Galliani titled, "The Faith Remains Unshaken." The hostages were determined to save the dignity of their principles and would rather remain in the squalor of their jails or their islands of confinement at peace with themselves, quote, than return to the so-called free world by bowing down to their jailers, whom they despised with concessions they knew to be false and shameful, end quote. The debate between Merlino and Malatesta received widespread attention both in Italy and abroad. Emma Goldman summarized it years later when she stated her position that anarchists should not cooperate with communists in elections. She wrote to Alexander Berkman that, quote, "You probably remember the controversy between Malatesta and Merlino. Of course, fascism wasn't known back then, but black reaction was. And it was Merlino who argued that anarchists, by joining the socialists during elections, would help defeat the reactionary gang. I don't know whether you remember Malatesta's reply. It was to the effect that the anarchists would, as they had always done, merely get the chestnuts out of the fire for the socialists and liberals, and they would injure their ideas beyond repair." End quote. Merlino's basic thesis was that the struggle for liberty must be fought on all fronts, including electoral politics. Although he recognized that anarchists do not aspire to political power, he did not consider it contrary to their principles to participate in electoral struggles against reactionary regimes. It was better to support a Republican or socialist candidate than a conservative one who was likely to impose martial law. Merlino looked with disfavor on the anarchist abstentionist position because he thought it had brought about two negative results. One, the separation of the abstentionist anarchists from the most active and militant part of the populace, and two, their abstention served to weaken them in front of the government. In practice, Merlino saw nothing contrary to anarchist principles in the electoral struggle. He did refuse, however, to condone anarchists serving as ministers in the government. This did not preclude the election of deputies to Parliament, who would probably always remain in the minority. Their election would be a method of popular agitation against a reactionary government. It would be their duty to speak out against the existing government, denouncing its arbitrariness. Finally, Merlino conceded that, although parliamentary methods, as all things of this world, had their drawbacks, it was a perfectly valid method of agitation and propaganda, suitable to be used by anarchists. Malatesta bitterly opposed Merlino's ideas. One of his main themes was that by getting people accustomed to voting and delegating authority, they are made powerless in handling their own communal affairs. Since anarchists don't aspire to power, there was no motive for them to assist those who do. Both Galliani and Malatesta rejected the use of protest candidates because they took away the unity of the struggle, which constituted the characteristic opposition of anarchism to politics. For Malatesta, the essence of parliamentarianism was that parliaments can make and impose laws. Contrary to Merlino, Malatesta thought that all anarchists had to fight this idea, as anarchists do not grant to others the ability to bind them. As Malatesta stated, quote, "Parliamentarianism is a form of government, and government means legislative power, judicial and executive powers. It means violence and coercion, and the imposition of force and the will of the governors on the governed." End quote. Thus, it must always and firmly be rejected by anarchists. Malatesta also argued that even if anarchists could win electoral politics, they would still not want to hold positions of power. Quote, "We are against the principle of government, and we do not believe that participating in it is the best way to renounce power." End quote. Furthermore, he recognized that abstentionism, although a question of tactics, was integrally related to the question of anarchist principles. Quote, "When one renounces it, abstentionism, one ends up renouncing also the principles involved, and that happens because of the natural connection between means and ends." End quote. Finally, he argued that, instead of legitimizing parliamentary government, anarchists should stand for its abolition. He wrote, quote, "Our mission, as anarchists, instead of showing to the people that parliamentary government, although it is the least bad of the types of government, is still a government. The remedy will not be in changing the form of government, but in abolishing it." End quote. The Merlino-Malatesta debate foreshadowed the problems that 20th century anarchists were to encounter in their efforts at political collaboration. We will find this true both in the case of the Russian and Spanish anarchists, which will now be examined. The historian Paul Avrich has noted that the anarchists in Russia had always set themselves apart from other radical groups by their, quote, "implacable opposition to the state in any form." Faithfully, they cleave to Bakunin's dictum that every government, no matter who controls it, is an instrument of oppression, nor did they exclude the dictatorship of the proletariat from this indictment. End quote. Years before Bakunin had predicted the anarchists' differences with Marx, when he had written in Statehood and Anarchy that the dictatorship of the proletariat would be, quote, "the most autocratic, the most despotic, the most arrogant, and the most contemptuous of all regimes." End quote. Though the anarchists desired, along with Lenin, to destroy the provisional government, Bakunin's warnings about the power-hungry communists lingered in their minds. When the Tsar abdicated in mid-March 1917, a provisional government was set up under Prince Lvov, who was superseded by Alexander Kerensky in July. When Kropotkin returned to Russia that summer, he was well received by the masses and the government. Kerensky offered the well-known Libertarian a cabinet post as Minister of Education, as well as a state pension, both of which Kropotkin declined. Kerensky certainly had in mind capitalizing on the popularity of Kropotkin if he could. Much to the dismay of the anarchists, the downfall of the Tsar fell far short of their principal objective, which was the social revolution and abolition of the Russian government. Although the February Revolution had overthrown the monarchy, it failed to eliminate the state. Some anarchists compared the February Rising to a game of musical chairs in which one ruler took the seat of another. Thus, the immediate aims of both the Bolsheviks and the anarchists came to coincide, since both desired the elimination of the provisional government. As the noted historian of this era, Paul Avrich, has written, quote, "This was all they shared in common, however. Collaboration on this end ultimately resulted in the destruction of anarchism in Russia." End quote. Kerensky's provisional government had elections scheduled for October, and as the time drew near for the Constituent Assembly to be selected, quote, anarchist spokesmen poured forth a veritable torrent of invective on the subject of representative government, end quote. Alexander Shapiro, whom we shall meet again in Spain, wrote that, quote, "No parliament can break the path towards liberty, that the good society can be realized only through the abolition of all power." Bill Shatov, another Russian emigre anarchist, declared that political power in any shape was not worth a rotten egg, and that political power can give us nothing, end quote. When Lenin seized power in the November 1917 coup, he was readily assisted by the anarchists. The latter blindly hoped that no new government would take the place of the provisional one. Quote, disregarding the preachments of Bakunin and Kropotkin against political coups, they had taken part in a seizure of power in the belief that power, once captured, could somehow be diffused and eliminated, end quote. With the establishment of the Bolshevik government, they found that it was impossible to eliminate political power by capturing it. This marriage of convenience, as Paul Avrich termed it, between the anarchists and Lenin lasted only as long as Lenin wanted it to. Lenin had used the anarchists to his own advantage, and when he was finished with them, there was nothing more to do than to eliminate them, since they were truly a threat to the Communist Party. The antagonism between the Soviets and the anarchists was further heightened when Lenin opened peace talks at Brest-Litovsk in the spring of 1918. Many anarchists had become so disillusioned with Lenin that they sought a complete break with him. The Bolsheviks, for their part, began to contemplate the suppression of their former allies, who had outlived their usefulness. A contemporary anarchist critique of Bolshevik power argued that it had offered abundant proof that, quote, state power possessed inalienable characteristics. It can change its label, its theory, and its servitors, but in essence it merely remains power and despotism in new forms, end quote. Finally, in April of 1918, armed violence broke out between the Bolsheviks and anarchists when the government conducted a raid against 26 anarchist centers in Moscow. A dozen Cheka agents were slaughtered, about 40 anarchists were killed or wounded, and more than 500 were taken prisoner. Practically all of the anarchist presses and periodicals were closed down, and shortly afterwards the Cheka conducted similar raids in Petrograd and the provinces. The anarchists reacted by accusing the Bolsheviks of having acted as Judases and betrayers. They also turned to violence to defend themselves and counterattack. Anarchist groups bombed the office of the Moscow Committee of the Communist Party while it was in session during 1919. Shortly before the bombing, they had described the Bolshevik dictatorship as the worst tyrant in human history. The violence was denounced by most prominent anarchist leaders, but nevertheless, the Soviet government used this violence as an excuse to make massive new arrests from anarchist ranks. Quote, Bolshevik spokesmen maintained that with the survival of the revolution at stake, it was imperative to snuff out violent opposition from every quarter. No anarchists, they insisted, were being arrested for their beliefs, but only for their criminal deeds, end quote. Paul Avrich has written that, quote, the deepening of the Civil War of 1918 to 1921 threw the anarchists into a quandary over whether to assist the Bolsheviks in their internecine with the whites. Ardent libertarians, the anarchists found the repressive policies of the Soviet government utterly reprehensible, yet the prospect of a white victory seemed even worse, end quote. The anarchists realized that by refusing to come to the assistance of the Bolsheviks, they might help tip the scales in favor of the whites. The anarchists were split apart by this issue. Opinions ranged all across the spectrum, from eager collaboration with the Communist Party to active, violent resistance against them. Some anarchists even became Communist Party members. In the end, a great many gave varying degrees of support to the regime. Nevertheless, there were a few anarchist stalwarts and diehards who had utmost contempt for their renegade colleagues. They contemptuously labeled them Soviet anarchists and claimed they had succumbed to the blandishments of politics. Quote, again and again they warned that political power is evil, that it corrupts all who wield it, that government of any kind stifles the revolutionary spirit of the people and robs them of their freedom, end quote. Lenin was impressed with the support provided by some of his Soviet anarchists, and in 1919 he commented that many anarchists were becoming dedicated supporters of Soviet power. Bill Shatov was an outstanding example. Shatov, whose comments against political power we read earlier, served Lenin's government as a military officer during 1919. He took a significant part of organizing the defense of Petrograd, and then as Minister of Transport in the Far Eastern Republic in 1920. Several years later, he was sent to the east to supervise the construction of the Turk-Sib Railroad. Perhaps it was poetic justice that Shatov was exiled to Siberia and was believed to have been shot during the purges of the late 1930s. Shatov justified his participation in the government by citing the danger of a reactionary takeover. Nevertheless, he admitted to Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman after their arrival in Russia in January of 1920 that, quote, the communist state in action is exactly what we anarchists have always claimed it would be, a tightly centralized power still more strengthened by the dangers of revolution, end quote. When Kropotkin died in February of 1921, his funeral represented the last great anarchist gathering in Russia. Certain important anarchist political prisoners were released from Cheka prisons for the day, and public support for the deceased anarchist prince was overwhelming. However, the following month, March 1921, witnessed the climax of the Soviet atrocities against the anarchists. The sailors and civilian population of Kronstadt, an island based on the Gulf of Finland, revolted against the Soviets. The rebels were suppressed by the Red Army under the direction of Trotsky. Following the climax of the revolt, new raids against the anarchists swept the country. Few anarchists were left at large, their bookstores were closed, and even the followers of the pacifist Tolstoy were imprisoned or banished. A number of pacifists had already been shot during the Civil War for refusal to serve in the Red Army. It was at this time that Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, and other foreign-born anarchists were in Russia, hoping to witness the revolution in practice. Their expectations were sorely disappointed. Emma Goldman threatened to stage a personal protest in order to call to Lenin's attention the persecution of the anarchists in Russia. Many of them were already in jail, where they had participated in at least one prolonged hunger strike, and many others had been shot. Finally, the Soviets granted amnesty to many of the better-known anarchist prisoners who had no record of violent opposition to the Soviet government. These freed prisoners had to leave the country at once. Meanwhile, quote, Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, and Sonia Alexander Shapiro, profoundly disheartened by the turn the revolution had taken, had made up their minds to immigrate also, end quote. Emma Goldman, on Revolution and Elections. Goldman and Berkman had been in Russia for nearly 2 years, January 1920 to December 1921, and had seen the revolution in action. Emma Goldman's reaction to that experience was recorded in her 2 books, My Disillusionment in Russia and in My Further Disillusionment in Russia. By the time of her departure from Russia, she had become highly critical of Lenin and his regime. She knew that power corrupts anarchists and communists, just as it corrupted their opponents. Her outlook on social revolution had been refined as a result of her experiences. No longer did she look upon the violent destruction of an existing regime and the social revolution as synonymous. The failure of the Russian Revolution was that it took superficial political changes, the replacement of the Tsar by Lenin, for an indication of systemic change. Nothing could have been further from the truth. As Emma Goldman wrote, quote, in its mad passion for power, the communist state even sought to strengthen and deepen the very ideas and conceptions which the revolution had come to destroy, with the concept that the revolution was only a means of securing political power. It was inevitable that all revolutionary values should be subordinated to the needs of the socialist state, indeed exploited to further the security of the newly acquired governmental power, end quote. The perversion of the revolution was crystallized for Emma Goldman by the all-dominating slogan of the Communist Party, quote, the end justifies all means, end quote. In a brilliant analysis of means and ends, Goldman asserted that, quote, there is no greater fallacy than the belief that aim and purposes are one thing, while methods and tactics are another. This conception is a potent menace to social regeneration. All human experience teaches that means cannot be separated from the ultimate aims. The means employed become, through individual habit and social practice, part and parcel of the final purpose. They modify it, and presently the aims and means become identical. From the day of my arrival in Russia, I felt it, at first vaguely, then ever more consciously and clear. The whole history of man is continuous proof of the maxim that to divest one's method of ethical concepts means to sink into the depths of utter demoralization. In that lies the tragedy of the Bolshevik philosophy as applied to the Russian Revolution, end quote. One of her final comments on her Russian experience was summed up in 1936, at the time of the Stalinist purges, when she claimed that the anarchist criticism of Russia had been vindicated. Our position, she wrote, quote, as regards power and dictatorship, has been strengthened by the events in Russia, end quote. All the people being purged began their lives with an ideal for which they suffered prison and exile. Quote, no sooner did they ascend to power than their past was wiped out and they became as savage in their persecution of their opponents as the enemies they came to destroy, end quote. She concluded, quote, for nothing so corrupts and disintegrates as power itself, end quote. The whole essence of the question about Russia was for her the fact that, quote, you cannot educate men for liberty by making them slaves, end quote, and this is what the Bolsheviks had tried to do. During the mid-1930s, Emma Goldman was concerned not only with the direction of events in Stalinist Russia, but also with the direction taken by the anarchist movement in Spain. She was to some extent intimately connected with the events in Spain because of her contacts in the international anarchist movement, as well as her 2 visits to Spain during the Civil War. Evidence of her concern is found in her correspondence and published articles, particularly in her discussion of anarchists and elections. In an article by this title appearing in the June-July 1936 Vanguard, she proposed and answered the following questions. Quote, 1. The question as to whether the abstention from participation in elections is for anarchists a matter of principle? I certainly think it is, and should be for all anarchists. 2. It is but logical for anarchists not to consider political participation as a simple question of tactics. Such tactics are not only incompatible with anarchist thought and principles, but they also injure the stand of anarchism as the one and only true revolutionary philosophy. 3. Can anarchists, without scruple and in the face of certain circumstances, exercise power during a transition period? I cannot understand how they can possibly aspire to power, end quote. For Emma Goldman, it was, quote, not the abuse of power, end quote, which corrupted everybody, but rather, quote, the thing itself, namely power, which is evil and which takes the very spirit and revolutionary fighting strength out of everybody who wields it, end quote. Collaboration and cooperation in elections and with the communists, as the anarchists were doing in Spain, did not meet with her approval. Quote, I cannot agree with the suggestion that anarchists should in grave times cooperate with the communists in elections. I myself consider it not only inconsistent with our views of vesting power to politicians by means of voting for them, I also consider it highly dangerous. We insist, do we not, that the means must harmonize as far as possible with the end. And our end being anarchism, I do not see how we can very well unite with any political party. With our past experience with socialists and communists, it seems folly to join them. But more important is my firm belief that we would be spitting ourselves in the face if we approved participation in elections. Fighting all power and all government as we do, how can we help by putting anyone in positions of power? We simply cannot and should not make the plunge. We can only stake our own position towards the fundamentals of anarchism, and that has always been opposition to the slick political machine that has ever corrupted the best of people or has paralyzed their efforts, end quote. Anarchists and the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939. Though Emma Goldman aided the Spanish anarchist movement during the Spanish Civil War, as her statements made clear, she disagreed with their participation in the Republican government. However, she stood behind them because they were fighting with their backs to the wall against the entire world. Their struggle was her second chance to see the revolution at last. She was in Spain from September 1936 until January 1937, at which time she went to London to help publicize the Republican cause. She was continually embroiled in disputes over anarchist principles and their collaboration in Spain. Her appointment as a collector of relief funds for the Catalan government somehow seemed to show her complicity, however much she denied it. She was sickened by the farcical comedy of anarchist leaders defending government property, which occurred in the aftermath of the May crisis in Barcelona. She agreed with her former companion in Russia, Alexander Shapiro, who complained that, quote, anarchists in government will and must act like all government officials and ministers, end quote. The important point about the Spanish Civil War is that for the first and only time in modern political history, there were anarchist ministers serving in both provincial and federal cabinets. Nothing like this had ever transpired in anarchist history. The Spanish anarchists had caused a terrible breach among both their international comrades and their principles. It is important to understand what motivated the Spaniards into holding office and participating in governments, and what, if any, lessons are to be learned from their experiences. The anarchist tradition in Spain has a long and rich history, mostly embroidered with violence and terrorism. By the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the anarchist present in Spain was a significant element, particularly among the working classes and their syndical trade unions. The CNT, Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, or National Confederation of Labor, had been founded in 1910 and was a national trade union. The influence of the anarchists saved it on various occasions from falling into the hands of other political organizations. In 1927, the anarchists founded their own trade union, the FAI, Federación Anarquista Ibérica, or Anarchist Freedom of Iberia, in an effort to radicalize their own movement. It was hoped that the FAI would act as a radical watchdog to correct the deviationist tendencies present within the CNT. The CNT and FAI shunned parliamentary activity and, in contrast to other labor parties, held no seats in the central or local government and had refrained from nominating candidates for parliament. They followed a syndicalist line, believing that direct action and strikes were necessary to accomplish the social revolution. The FAI, the more radical organization of the two, made no distinction between governments of the right or the left, just as they made no distinction between individual politicians. For them, all politicians were equally bad. Post-World War I Spain had suffered a series of military coups and rebellions and experienced continual struggle against the monarchy. In December of 1931, a new constitution was adopted after the dissolution of the royal throne. The Republican government of Azana was hard-pressed by discontent, especially in the autonomous province of Catalan, which was granted home rule in late 1932. In early 1933, there was a large uprising in Barcelona, sparked by anarchist and syndicalist unrest with the progress of social reform. In November of that year, the first regular elections for the Cortes were held. The anarcho-syndicalists generally took a hardline, abstentionist approach to this election. Both the CNT and FAI had urged their members not to vote. Tierra y Libertad, Land and Liberty, declared a month before the elections in November, quote, "Our revolution is not made in Parliament, but in the streets." Quote, "We're not interested in changing governments," end quote, Isaac Puente, an influential anarcho-syndicalist, had written at the same time. Quote, "What we want is to suppress them. Whatever side wins, whether the right or the left, will be our enemy, and will have at its disposal the truncheons of the assault guards," end quote. A few days before the election, Tierra y Libertad editorialized, quote, "Workers, do not vote. The vote is a negation of your personality. Turn your backs on those who ask you to vote for them. They are your enemies. As far as we are concerned, they are all the same. All politicians are our enemies, whether they be Republicans, monarchists, communists, or socialists. Parliament is a filthy house of prostitution, toying with the interests of the country and the people," end quote. The November 1933 election for the Cortes resulted in giving the parties of the right 44% of the seats. Throughout 1934 and 1935, social and political unrest continued to plague Spain. Catalan sovereignty was proclaimed and its independence suppressed by military efforts. Finally, in January of 1936, the Cortes was dissolved and new elections were called for February. These elections were lukewarmly endorsed by many Spanish anarchists after the Popular Front coalition promised to free all political prisoners. It was largely the support of the anarchists and syndicalists which enabled the Popular Front to come to power. This combination of Republicans, socialists, syndicalists, communists, and anarchists won a decisive victory over their political opponents. The new Popular Front government which took power proclaimed an amnesty, as it had promised, but soon faced the Civil War, which broke out on July 18, 1936, as a result of the rebellion by military chiefs in Morocco. The Popular Front government held its own in Madrid and Barcelona, but the nationalist forces made advances in other parts of the country. Catalan, which had already previously regained autonomous status, immediately sought anarchist participation in the existing provincial government, the Generalitat. The CNT had its largest following in Catalan, and it was logical that the existing provincial government would want to take advantage of its presence. Luis Companys, president of the Generalitat, summoned representatives of the CNT-FAI to his office as soon as the uprising had been defeated, July 20th of 1936, in order to obtain anarchist and syndicalist legitimization of his rule. Garcia Oliver and Diego Abad de Santillán became ministers in the government of the Catalan Generalitat. Santillán saw no other choice than for anarchists to share the administrative power with the Companys' government in Catalan. Paralysis of the federal government in Madrid and continued advances by the nationalist forces threatened to envelop Spain in fascism. It was up to the anarchists to transform the Militia Committee of Catalan into a truly revolutionary body. Regarding his experience as minister in the Catalan government, Santillán in 1938 wrote, quote, "Simply as governors, we, the anarchists, were no better than anyone else, and we have already proved that our intervention in governments served only to reinforce governmentalism," end quote. Meanwhile, the rebel nationalist forces had made further advances into Republican Spain, and on September 4, 1936, the Popular Front formed a new government under the leadership of Largo Caballero, a former socialist minister. If the Caballero government was to be more than a government in name, it would have to, quote, assume control of all of the elements of state power. The work of reconstructing state power could not be achieved, or at least would be extremely difficult to achieve, without the participation in the government of the extreme wing of the Libertarian movement, end quote. This part of the movement was represented by the anarchist-oriented CNT and FAI. Although views differed, most of Caballero's colleagues advised his seeking the participation of the Libertarians in the government. The advantages of having them share the responsibility for its measures would be indubitable. Quote, the entry of representatives of the CNT into the present Council of Ministers would certainly endow the directive organ of the nation with fresh energy and authority, end quote, wrote Claridad, one of Largo Caballero's journals on October 25th of 1936. Especially, quote, in view of the fact that a considerable segment of the working class, now absent from its deliberations, would feel bound by its measures and authority, end quote. What Caballero's advisers could not guess was whether or not the anarcho-syndicalists would wish to become ministers in the government and share in the reconstruction of the state. This was questionable, even though quite recently they had violated their principles by joining the Catalan regional government. Furthermore, Largo Caballero had tried, when forming his cabinet in September of 1936, to secure the participation of the anarcho-syndicalists by offering them a single ministerial seat without portfolio. Benet Balotin had noted that Caballero, quote, needed their participation in the belief that they would feel themselves bound by his government measures and authority, end quote. However, at that time they rejected his offer based on their traditional anti-governmental stand and their personal distrust. Caballero had been responsible for persecution of anarchists early in his political career. The CNT had not been ready to enter the Madrid government in September, but in October of 1936, a plenary session of the regional federations of the CNT was held for the purpose of discussing the matter further. The result was that the CNT authorized its representatives to, quote, conduct negotiations for bringing the CNT into the government, end quote. The CNT justified its position by stating, quote, in order to win the war and to save our people and the world, it is ready to collaborate with anyone in a directive organ, whether this organ be called a council or a government, end quote. In their negotiations with Caballero, the CNT representatives asked for 5 ministries, including war and finance, but he rejected their demand. Finally, on November 3, 1936, they accepted 4, justice, industry, commerce, and health, none of which, however, was vital. Furthermore, the portfolios of industry and commerce had previously been held by one minister. The 4 CNT members named to the government were Juan Garcia Oliver, Justice, Juan Lopez, Commerce, Federica Montseny, Health and Public Assistance, and Juan Piero, Industry. As we have seen, Caballero was partially motivated by his desire to invest his government with greater authority. President Azana, who had to sign the decrees appointing the anarchist ministers, was hesitant to do so. Caballero claimed that Azana did not see the significance of getting the anarchists into office. Quote, from terrorism and direct action, Spanish anarchism, had moved to collaboration and to sharing the responsibilities of power. It was a unique event in the world and would not be sterile. Caballero told him, Azana, that if he did not sign the decrees, I would resign, end quote. The communists also had a similar ulterior motive in drawing the anarchists into the government. They hoped to bolster their own power. The communists were concerned with world opinion, particularly in France, Britain, and America. They wished to give an appearance of legality to the Spanish Republic. Thus, they hoped that the participation of the anarcho-syndicalists in the government would placate foreign opinion and enhance their prospects of receiving military assistance from these Western powers. Furthermore, after the war, it was revealed that the communists hoped to create a breach in the ranks of the anarchists and syndicalists by drawing the CNT into government collaboration. In fact, there was a discord in the ranks of the anarchists and syndicalists because nearly everyone was unhappy with what they recognized to be a compromise. Their justification was simply that if the anarchists did not take a role in the Republican government, a dictatorship worse than Russia would result, and that the prospects of a fascist regime were more unacceptable to them than the act of collaboration with the existing government. Reluctant criticism, both within Spain and outside Spain, was immediately forthcoming from anarchists. Emma Goldman, who had argued with Federica Montseny for hours against collaboration, quote, believed that the anarchists had abandoned political principle to save Spain from further foreign intervention. Such a course was not surprising in the context of Spanish history, but the real tragedy of the anarchists was that they were pulled further and further into the mire of compromise, end quote. The December 1936 Vanguard carried remarks on the Spanish situation, translated from a French anarchist journal. The author, Luigi Bertoni, wrote partly in justification and partly in recognition of the anarchist departure from principle. Quote, "The present Spanish government does, indeed, differ considerably from any ordinary government. That is especially evident from the hostility shown towards it on the part of governments all over the world. But it is still essentially and practically a government, and must therefore contain, to a considerable extent, the faults inherent in it. Thus it is not without apprehension that I view the discharging of ministerial functions on the part of our four comrades, despite the complete confidence we have in them. Rather than governmental anarchists, I should call them revolutionary anarchists." End quote. Another outspoken critic of anarchist collaboration was Camillo Bernini, an Italian anarchist living in Barcelona. Robert Kern, a historian of this era, has noted that beginning October 1936, Bernini wrote, quote, vitriolic articles in his Guerra de Classes demanding, among other things, development of an international revolutionary campaign as the prime defense of the Republic. He also attacked the mood of anarchist collaboration. Difficulties in Aragon did not necessitate a total capitulation to the communists. Membership in the Popular Front cabinet, far from solving anything, would only put anarchists under extreme coercion to maintain unanimity in Madrid. All differences of ideology would eventually be extinguished and Stalinist statism imposed, a tragic end to a long anarchist tradition. End quote. Before Bernini was assassinated in 1937 for his anti-communist attacks, he wrote an open letter to Federica Montseny, in which he claimed that the acceptance of the ministerial posts had no direct bearing on the war effort or upon the problems that the anarchists hoped to solve by joining the cabinet. In his open letter, Bernini asked, quote, "The hour has come to inquire whether the anarchists are in the government for the purpose of being the vestals to serve as the Phrygian cap for some of the politicians flirting with the enemy, or with the forces anxious to restore the republic of all classes." End quote. Federica Montseny, one of the four who had accepted ministerial position in the Madrid government of Caballero, was one of their most outspoken defenders. She and her family represented several generations of radical anarchist activism in Spain. Federica was born in 1905, the daughter of Federico Urales, who was one of the most well-respected anarchist theoreticians and journalists in Spain during the first 2 decades of the century. In the early 1920s, she and her father renewed publication of a famous anarchist journal, La Revista Blanca. Federica was editor of the journal and an author of many novels. By the fall of 1936, she was one of the most popular anarchist leaders and theoreticians in Spain. At the age of 31, she accepted the ministerial post for health and public assistance, becoming the first woman ever to hold a ministerial office in the Spanish national government. There is little doubt that Montseny was a purist, at least in principle. In a 1934 article in La Revista Blanca, she wrote that all governments are evil. Quote, "It became obvious that no theory justified the existence of any state. Be it socialist, communistic, democratic, or fascistic, they were all the same. They were states. Each kind of state possessed the same purpose, the promotion of friends, the suppression of the workers by keeping them submissive, and the exploitation of the many by the few." End quote. A state in all places and at all times represented, quote, "oppression and the annihilation of man." A state was incarnated in armed organisms which sustain through the method of terror and force the power which dominates, robs, and which kills. End quote. As her biographer adds, Montseny insisted that her view of the state applied not only to traditional governments, but to revolutionary ones as well. So it is clear that Montseny understood that all governments were evil, even though she became a minister in one. The underlying justification for her action was that she saw the nationalists as a greater threat to anarchist ideals than any liberal Republican government. She felt it foolish to allow oneself to be drowned by the tide of fascism. The retrograde nature of fascism demanded a new approach. Anarchists were among the first to realize that the struggle against fascism was of utmost importance. In a 1937 talk, she said, quote, "We think, by cooperating with Caballero, we will avoid a repetition of the fate of the anarchist movements in other countries where communists assumed direction of the revolution." End quote. It was not without trepidation that she entered the government in November of 1936. In a speech she made in France in 1945, she reportedly said of her doubts about becoming a governmental minister, quote, "I asked for 24 hours to think over the matter. I consulted my father, who thoughtfully said, 'You know what this means. In fact, it is the liquidation of anarchism and of the CNT. Once in power, you will not rid yourself of power.'" End quote. After she resigned from the cabinet in mid-1937, she declared, quote, "As a daughter of veteran anarchists, I regarded my entry into the government, my acceptance of the post to which the C&T had assigned me, as having more significance than the mere appointment of a minister. What inhibitions, what doubts, what anguish I had personally to overcome in order to accept the post. For me, it implied a break with my life's work, with a whole past linked to the ideals of my parents. It meant a tremendous effort, an effort made at the cost of many tears." End quote. She also noted that the complicity of anarchists in government would, as she put it, quote, "ruin many of us morally." End quote. It's safe to conclude that ultimately she regretted her departure from principle and her involvement in the government. She had not accomplished anything lasting by her efforts. The Caballero government managed to sustain itself in power until May of 1937, at which time it was succeeded by that of Negrin, which excluded the anarcho-syndicalists from participation. The four anarchist ministers had done little to strengthen the position of the anarchist movement during their time in office, and had irreparably injured anarchist ideas. This realization burst upon the Libertarian movement in 1938 as Franco came nearer and nearer to total victory. During the last 2 weeks of October 1938, national plenary meetings of the regional federations of the Libertarian movement were held in Barcelona. 3 major divisions of opinion were to be found among those present. A majority held that the Libertarian movement should participate in politics, as they had already done. 2 minority views existed. 1, that the FAI should be converted into a political party of the C&T and attempt to represent the Libertarian movement in the government once again. And 2, the view, represented rather feebly by the Young Libertarians of Catalan, quote, that all participation in government should be renounced, end quote. During one of the sessions of the Young Libertarians, their views came across rather picturesquely. Quote, "To try to join the state in order to destroy it is like taking your wives and sisters to brothels in order to abolish prostitution," end quote. The result of the plenary meetings were resolutions in favor of political participation. One resolution read, quote, "Our direct participation in the administrative bodies of political, economic, and military life was motivated by our high sense of responsibility and the need for cooperation in the fight against fascism in order to facilitate a victory. This participation has not been a correction of our tactics, but rather an intelligent addition to our methods in accord with the circumstances and in response to an abnormal situation in the life of the people," end quote. However, in an effort to purify their intentions, another resolution read, quote, "The Libertarian movement, having taken part in politics, in violation of its tradition, declares the political power, the state, will always be the antithesis of anarchism. And our circumstantial participation in power has been, for the purpose of opposing to the greatest possible extent, from a position in power and from everywhere else, the strangulation of the revolution," end quote. Many historians agree that the collaboration of the C&T and FAI in the Republican government failed to improve the military situation during their time in power. Vernon Richards, another historian of this era, concluded that, quote, "It certainly added prestige to the government," end quote. In his opinion, there is little question that the anarchists were, quote, "outwitted and outmaneuvered by the politicians on every issue. Equally significant is that their contact with politicians had no ideological influence on the politicians, whereas a number of leading members of the C&T were in the end won over to the very principles of government and centralized authority," end quote. They became victims of the false belief that, quote, "power was only evil in the wrong hands and for a wrong cause, and not that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely," end quote. If we had measured the number of anarchists in Spain by the refusal to collaborate in electoral politics, then we would probably have found very few of them there. Moreover, it seems that few of them understood the implications of their philosophy, which was not only anti-electoral, but also anti-war. One of the most basic contradictions faced by the Spanish anarchists was the fact, as John Bradamus put it, that they, quote, "sought to make war and social revolution at the same time," end quote. This was impossible in theory and contradictory in practice. The choice between fighting the forces of Franco on the one hand and fighting for the revolution on the other hand seemed to be answered by violence, no matter which way they turned. Before the Civil War broke out, there had been interest by some Spanish anarchists in the ideas of the French anarchist, Sébastien Faure, who was strongly anti-nationalist and anti-militaristic. Faure's nonviolence attracted Spaniards fighting a military dictatorship. Faure believed that organizing masses of everyday people into a Gandhi-like campaign of public nonviolence would render military power useless, end quote. However, Faure's ideas were not followed up, and here lies at least part of the real tragedy of Spanish anarchism. The Spaniards did not see the incongruity of trying to wage war on the basis of anarchist principles. War and anarchism are simply repugnant. One is destruction and extermination, and the other is mutualistic voluntarism. The anarcho-militias, manned by anarchists during the Civil War, were full of problems, for the simple reason that the individual anarchist soldier refused to recognize any authority. He took a dim outlook on rank, military titles, and regimentation. As one anarchist commentator on the Civil War noted, quote, "War has always been a tomb, never a means of revolution," end quote. The ultimate problem of violence and social revolution facing the Spanish anarchists was that an anarchist society could not be established and maintained on the basis of coercion. Recourse to violence was always an indication of weakness, not strength. The revolution with the greatest possibility of success would be the one which was brought about peacefully. Only then would there be any valid sign of unanimity among the population on the objectives of the revolution. One of the chief justifications of the Spanish anarchist participation in government and war was that they were choosing the lesser of two evils. During the events leading up to the elections of February of 1936, Diego Abad de Santillan observed this very thing, that, quote, "Participation in the elections was advisable. We gave power to the leftists, convinced that under the circumstances they were the lesser evil," end quote. In an astute analysis of this justification, Murray Bookchin observed, quote, "This could be construed as a reasonable and honest statement if action based on the lesser evil was seen for what it really was, a distinct departure from principle, openly admitted to be such, a bitter pill to be swallowed to deal with an acute illness." But after this has been said, one must emphasize that it would have been preposterous to expect a lesser evil to behave with a noble virtue. The best the CNT and FAI could have hoped for from the newly elected state would have been neutrality. To base one iota of their policy on active state support was not only absurd, but marked the initial steps toward the politicalization of the Spanish anarchist movement and its eventual conversion into a political party. The anarchists were slowly becoming clients of the creature they most professed to oppose, the state power itself. Having taken to the vote, they began to take to politics." End quote. Concluding remarks. This review of the European anarchist tradition has offered many reasons for the rejection of electoral participation and political power by voluntarists today. Malatesta was the best spokesman for the non-electoral anarchists, having defended that position against Merlino as early as 1897. Malatesta saw not only the dangers of electoral politics, but he foresaw the dangers of war and revolutionary violence years before they developed in Spain. In 1930, regarding anarchism and revolutions, he wrote, quote, "I incline to the view that the complete triumph of anarchy will come by evolution, gradually rather than by violent revolution. In any case, if we take into account our sparse numbers and the prevalent attitudes among the masses, and if we do not wish to confuse our wishes with the reality, we must expect that the next revolution will not be an anarchist one. And therefore, what is more pressing is to think of what we can and must do in a revolution in which we will be a relatively small and badly armed minority. But we must, however, beware of ourselves becoming less anarchist, because the masses are not ready for anarchy. If they want a government, it is unlikely that we will be able to prevent a new government being formed. But this is no reason for our not trying to persuade people that government is useless and harmful, or preventing the government from also imposing on us and others like us who don't want it. If we are unable to prevent the constitution of a new government, if we are unable to destroy it immediately, we should in either case refuse to support it in any shape or form. Disobedience on principle, resistance to the bitter end against every imposition by the authorities, and an absolute refusal to accept any position of command. In this way, we shall not only achieve anarchy, which cannot be opposed against the wishes of the people, but at least we shall be preparing the way for it." End quote. And again in 1932, he wrote, quote, "The primary concern of every government is to ensure its continuance in power, irrespective of the men who form it. If they are bad, they want to remain in power in order to enrich themselves and to satisfy their lust for authority. And if they are honest and sincere, they believe that it is their duty to remain in power for the people. The anarchists could never, even if they were strong enough, form a government without contradicting themselves and repudiating their entire doctrine. And should they do so, it would be no different from any other government. Perhaps it would be even worse." End quote. Wherever and whenever anarchists have engaged in war and or electoral politics, they have inevitably failed both militarily and politically. One cannot remain an anarchist and take part in war or government. By compromising one's anarchism this way, one does not make failure less certain, only more humiliating. That is the lesson of anarchist history.
Thank you for listening to Essential Libertarianism. You can check out the archives of all of our episodes at essentiallibertarianism.com. And you can subscribe to future episodes on any podcatcher, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, and more. This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.